algebra, engineering, mathematics. It was not a renaissance, but a reset. History was hidden and erased in order to hide what had happened. The empire was rebranded to hide, and it wasn't rebuilt. It was here all along. Some of it was demolished, even. So let's get into the economy of Tartary, because what's sort of interesting is this idea that it was an international agreement across many nations, including American Indians, who, by the way, were a confederacy. And when I say confederacy, you kind of intuitively know that they had chiefdoms, but they were literally part of the confederacy, fought on the South, and kept slaves themselves. So it's an interesting part that we'll get into. So before we get too far in, I just want to talk about taking all of these ideas and tying them together. The first thing you're going to want to do is take all the ideas that you have and just put them away for a minute. It doesn't mean you have to forget them, but you're going to just want to put them in another place. And the best way to do that is to figure out what you know is been taught to you, and then what you can perceive about it with your senses, and replace your preconceptions with your senses. And then I want you to think about all of these things that you've heard and seen and felt and tasted and smelled even, and empathized with and been aware of the feeling. So part of the series we'll be looking at the difference between truth and hidden meaning. So you might wonder, what's the point of studying history? Because you know already that history is not true about the subject, which it is lying. However, lies invariably are about truth. So we can study these lies and find the deeper meanings. So we're going to look at things like symbols and words, particularly ones that mean pejoratives or negatives, that actually have positive connotations. Primitive is a great example. We're told that the people that lived long ago were primitive. But when we think about this word, primitive, primal, primordial, prime, comes out. And we know prime root really means prime radical. So it's more likely that they were quite civilized, actually, and that they're hiding something. So we're going to get into what sort of a society that they had constructed. Historically, a lot of social contract theory comes to the Magna Carta, although Cyrus's cylinder of Columbus Day 539 BC technically is perhaps more important. The important thing about that also is before Christ. I know we want to say common, but there's a lot of reasons why we should talk about what that word really means. Christ and Messiah mean anointed one, which refer to the Exodus oil made of cannabis that the Therapeutica used to anoint each other during the times of Gnostic Occidental mysticism. So it's interesting that they haven't changed the calendar. They've just sort of changed its name. I mean, go ahead, use another calendar. I did for a long time. Switch to the Mayan long count. It's a great calendar. Just write it on your hand every day. But if we're going to use BCE and CE, I think we should describe it differently as before the collapse era and the communist era, which really makes a lot of sense to take the common era and to use iconoclasm to steal the work, change the names, and present some sort of a false history. Anyway, so this idea that the Magna Carta was signed under duress by a tyrannical king who was unfair, an absolute monarch, foolish, and considered ugly, and then the people were saved and their rights were restored to them. This is a false legacy. What really happened is nothing like this. And the reason we know that is because the story tells you about a king who was forced to sign a contract. An agreement must be voluntary. Any forced involuntary contract is essentially non-legally binding. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, but in general, the idea is to know what you have participantly signed a contract of and what the rules are. So let's look at this history slightly differently. King John Plantagenet, who, yes, looks not so ugly, in fact, looks a lot like Christ, was threatened upon signature with death if he did not sign, which is sort of an interesting metaphor for our social contracts that we keep to this day. And it is an important thing to remember that efficiency of breach is used to this day. So every contract has a clause, including the Magna Carta. And every contract is based on some sort of uniform commercial code. You can make a contract of your own, but if you don't, it's often assumed that you're using the Uniform Commercial Code. And in the Uniform Commercial Code, it is written that when you accept a benefit, you are obligated to accept the obligations and duties of that contract. For instance, if you eat a fruit in a store, you're expected to pay the price. And these are the agreements that we live for. It's part of relationships, which is a form of symbiosis. And there's many kinds of symbiosis, but essentially the concept is that the union gives strength. There's not just positive or negative symbiosis, but in general, symbiosis makes it possible for many different things to work together to become a larger thing. Sort of like the Siphonosphorae, which is a jellyfish order, actually comprised of 188 species of jellyfish, which could not live independently, but together create an inseparable duo, the body politic. And the human is in fact a body politic as well. This is why we use this term. We are a sea of many species, and the union brings us together into a form of hierarchy, and that complexity of specialization requires us to have a symbiosis. So there are types of symbiosis. Commensalism is a type of symbiosis where neither one is affected. Parasitic symbiosis is where one takes from the other and the other loses in the relationship. And there are a lot of parasitic relationships around us. And the parasites produce offspring, which continue to create new relationships and to live off of the larger organism. Parasites that practice lecherous occult and the destruction of our society in order to benefit themselves, to empower themselves, and to take away what little we have because they do not produce enough for themselves. And while they may think that it often is beneficial or at least commensal, it's often not. It's often parasitic. So a great relationship would be an example, a non-parasitic relationship would be an example of the wolf and the raven. And it's a relationship that goes back in the arts thousands of years. Into the Indo-Aryan times, there was a relationship between the Vikings and the tribes of the Scythians, and they created a trading empire, which allowed for nomadic persons to meet and citizens to meet in cities. And this allowed for an expansive empire that had diversity of race and religion. So often when people on the internet now are worried about the past, they say, you know, Africa or Egypt or North America or Asia, and sort of exclusively, but we know that we were all connected at one point and that there was some sort of symbiosis. So looking around the planet, there are the ruins of all of these great civilizations. There's these temples everywhere, and there are words and symbols which have been obscured but still leave remnants. For instance, Tartarian has the Torah and Aryan in the title. Also in the etymologue, we're looking at words like territory, tariff, trade, barter, tartan. Just using your vocabulary, you can find a lot of words that are rooted in Tartary. And Sanskrit is a great clue for this, because of all the Indo-Aryan languages that are rooted in Sanskrit, we'll find that Hindu languages like Hindi and Germanic languages like German itself have very similar words and terms and alphabets. For instance, in Sanskrit, Mama Nama means my name is, where mein Namen is, you know, my name in German. So it's spread very clearly, and then you can see the differences in pronunciations. For instance, in Spanish, do you like bands? If you like the shoes, the Vans, I remember hearing, because B and V and D and T can often be exchanged. And spelling does matter in ways, because you'd rather be on a desert island with dessert. It also affects the way people speak depending on where they're from. This is how we know about the lisp of the Catalan accent in Barcelona, Spain, because the royal family. But it's not that confusing to see how they were able to spread this language so far. When you look at the planet from a northern projection of the pole, you can see how close these places really are to each other, especially with boats. So carrying this culture across North America, Eurasia, would have been a fast path. And we can see the records of Phoenician letters and Etruscan letters and the Roman, and we see how they came even from Sumerian, from the Tartary. So Kemet, which is one of our oldest records of African culture, it shows this as well. And while it is very clearly a African empire, worships, like the rest of the empires, something greater than themselves. So I'm not going to say it's, you know, extraterrestrial, but there is some sort of sacred geometry that's worth noting. And I think that is a good subject on itself that is worth looking into. I recommend videos by Scott Onstott on the subject. Probably the best word to describe Secrets in Plain Sight, his series on the sacred geometry of reality. The word is definitive. It's just nothing I've found more. I would say you should buy his books. They're fantastic. I'm highly recommending his series. So the history of the symbols of the Tartarian Empire are built into its structure. There were star forts across the land and sea. There were players in this game that was an economy. And there was a banker system that brought things back and forth in a self-propelled civilization, which saw technology as worship. And this explains why they worshipped the propeller so much. And I know this is kind of scary subject for some people, but really, it's, even if it's been forbidden because you think it's a symbol of hate, please remember that all talismans have whatever meanings you project on them. Context is everything, and it's a really bad idea to put negative energy into a symbol. I mean, that's just a tip that I would recommend. And in general, if you're going to give up the propeller, you might as well give up carrots and spinach and animal rights too, because they're all inextricably linked by identity politics, if you really feel that way. And a better thing to do would probably be to dismantle the hate and find the true root of these symbols. Of course, that's totally up to you if you want to give up propellers and vegetables. But an example of some people that do love the propeller and are not evil, as far as I can tell, are the Jains, who are a pacifist Hindu cult that goes back many millennia. It's a religion that does not harm, it won't even harm a tuber, won't kill potatoes, won't eat roots from under the earth, will explicitly choose to eat vegetables, blossoms, and not kill the vegetables themselves. It's such an interesting religion, and definitely not one that is associated with hate or murder or supremacy, unless it's the supreme divine individual spirit. But this also shows us that there's this great colorful culture that spanned the world, and that it believed in this self-generating living fractal system, and that these symbols were lucky, and that they were powerful, and not just powerful in an esoteric or an engineering sense, but that those two were essentially the same thing. And so it makes all of a sudden so much sense why these two symbols are so inextricably linked, the star fort and the propeller swastika, because without them they could not get from one to the other, and they could not defend the other with the other. But we're told that these are evil because they're old, and we've gone through an era of iconoclasm, destroying maps, destroying symbols, taking and replacing, often rebranding when possible. A great example, of course, is the symbol of fasces, which is a number of rods bundled together with an axe head at the top. And what is an axe head, right? It's a tool, very clearly a tool. It's not a weapon. It could be a weapon, you know, but it's not. It's a tool that could be used to defend, but it's mainly a beautiful, elegant tool that can be used to craft, to build houses, to make fires, to defend, but mainly it's a tool. So it's an interesting symbol that they use to represent fasces as a number of fragile reeds that are together stronger when attached. And it's destroyed everywhere we go. They tear it down. They don't want you to see it. And it's not just ISIS that's destroying these icons. And it's not just in Europe or in Asia. Across the world, we're destroying everything we have of the past, whether it was about something good or not. It's being justified as if it's for this better future. So, a people that have a lot of imagery but somehow has survived are the Slavs, and it's not the same as the Soviets that you have seen so much of. The Soviet Union architecture is very specific, but in old country there was a lot of beautiful structures. There was essentially the fairy tale folk cottage style that we think of from art books, but real. And these are some examples mainly of the inexpensive cottages, these wooden houses and cottages and churches that survived or were somehow, documented. But these are just the inexpensive, comparably to the large castles that existed. And we'll see peacock feathers and notice tattoos of sacred geometrical patterns and see that the Slavonic people were a great and cultured people, colorful, diverse, and part of the Tartarian Empire, along with the Scythians. The Scythians are a people that are remembered through the scythe today, which was their tool for harvesting. It's also considered the root for the Sith, which is an interesting connection to the Bene Gesserit from Dune that Star Wars had manipulated into sort of a Disneyfied version. They're connected to the Aryans who had boats and long houses. Now, I know when you say Aryans, but really, yeah, it's okay to be Aryan. The Indo-Aryans are a group that they rose out of Mesopotamia and eventually went around the world, and they're known for their boats, which they have in Eritrea and they have in the Viking world. But is it not unlikely that they were just part of this greater empire that we now know existed in the same places that they traveled? And we see the examples of tribes which look like mixed between Scandinavians and Scythians or Asians, and it starts to make sense why there are so many diverse races in the last 500 to 1,000 years because of traveling by sea, even though the origin myth really described there being many less races, in fact. And so looking at the longhouses of the Pacific West coast of the North Americans, we can see that there is some truth to the official history that this Leif Erikson character had come from Scandinavia through Greenland to Vinland and discovered the New World, at some point making arrangements for trade with the Scythians, and that they stayed and created a cultural exchange that has lasted. And you might say that it could just be intuitively logic that they look the same, but I think the more you look at it, the more you see the specificity of their design is from this Malaysian, Indo-Aryan, American trade. And so we have reasons to believe that it's not just a landlocked continent like Gondwana or Pangaea or an ice bridge, but actually boats in interaction. But any of these solutions will describe why we have these noble savages, as they were called, who were cultured, civilized, and also in some cases clearly more Asiatic or more Scandinavian than others, including the Han tribe of Canada. So the Han, the Asian, the Chinese, let's talk about the Chinese first, because those are all different things. And before we get into the Chinese, let's talk about origin models for nations. So I use the trapezoid scheme, and the way I look at it is usually a foreign king invades, not with his own sons, but often with conscripted soldiers from another defeated nation. And they're then forced to defeat the enemies of the king, which exhaust the defeated empire and continually exhaust the undefeated empire into defeat. When the nation is defeated, they're conscripted, they're enslaved, they're culturally erased, and they are assimilated into a working class or a soldier class, like the formerly defeated that helped defeat for the king the new nation. And this perpetuates colonialism and also the culture through a system called kyriarchy. And kyriarchy is a system of cross-sectional polarizations that are used to isolate and to antagonize different groups of people into submission to a larger system. So you might consider yourself male or female, but you might be black or white, or you might be Republican or liberal. And each one of these cross sections puts you in a smaller and smaller group where you have less and less advocates from the rest of the identity politic. So using the system, it puts the upper class at the top and the slave class at the bottom, and gives a certain amount of leeway to the middle class so long as they encourage the lower class to behave and are discouraged by the lower class from misbehaving. And this also translates to an essentiality for concern, because your capacity for concern is dependent on your ability to take care of your fundamental physiological needs, your safety, your love, and self-esteem before you can reach self-actualization. So it essentially licenses self-actualization for the elite and takes it away as an option for the poorer classes. And it's a repeatable experiment. You can see this all over the world, in India with the caste system, in the serfs of Europe, which had a religion at the top, incidentally similar to the Brahmin priesthood above the princes, and in Latin American society as well. And another interesting thing about this model is it shows that the foreign king is at the top and the conscripted soldiers are in the middle, and the defeated nation is always, always, always at the bottom. And so looking at the Latin Americans, of course, you have the peninsulars at the top and their mixed race slightly underneath them. The Africans who had been brought in to slave are above the indigenous. And that's not the only place you're going to find that. You look into India, the Indo-Aryans at the top are not the natives, the untouchables are. And there's plenty of statistical evidence to show, and etymological and linguistic evidence to show that this is the case. And, you know, ask a Tamil. But looking into Europe, it's very, very similar. It's not that Europe was ever really run by Europeans, as far as we can tell. I mean, England was a Roman Britannic state for a very long time, full of slaves, and it is to this day run by the Wilhelm House of Windsor, which is, you know, their British English version of their name Wilhelm, but they're not hiding it very well. I mean, King George III couldn't speak English during the American Revolution, which I'm sure made it easier for the Masons to manipulate independence and anti-disestablishmentarianism. But he wasn't the first king either. It's not that the German line is the first. I mean, William the Conqueror, a Norman, could not speak English either. For 300 years, his line did not. So this is where we get back into who is China. Because if England is in English and South America is in South American, and India isn't run by the Indians, I doubt China is either. And there's 56 ethnic minorities that are listed, not counting the ones that are completely eradicated or in the process of being so. And they're fascinating, interesting people with great cultures. For instance, the Hmong people, who have some of the most fantastic magic that's still practicable to this day. And very, very much notice the peacock on her shirt as well, because the peacock you will find again and again. The Yi people, fantastically different designed clothes. And yeah, sure, she looks Chinese. The Sake people look pretty Chinese in this picture, but do their clothes. And that's a good example of the hidden culture. The Tibetans. There are remnants of conquered peoples in these Chinese. You've seen them become Chinified, but you have not seen them become Chinese. Ethnic cleansing does not fully work. And I know this is a subject that China is trying to say is at very least not to be talked about, whether or not it's true. But I would say that whether or not it's impolite, the evidence is honorable, that their homes have been occupied and their culture has been erased. And I think it's also important to watch the film Hero if you ever have the chance, which is a Jet Li film, a propaganda film from China that was released in the United States by Quentin Tarantino. And essentially it tells the story of the Chinese occupying the Chinese lands, and then I should go back to that. I'm sorry, we'll go back to this point. But basically, in China, there was a rain of arrows and a burning of all the books and the destruction of all the culture. And the question is asked: if all of history was erased and only one single symbol from your culture could be saved, which symbol would you save? And this is like, you know, these are the sad feels I get. Like, honestly, I can't help but feel for iconoclasm. That's something that really gets me. I think about the hidden Christians of Japan that were unable to admit what they believed for hundreds of years under threat of being crucified upside down. So we'll get back into that. Let me go a little bit further back, though, because I skipped forward to talk about that movie. So, how do you murder a mandala? And here's an example of a suppressed culture in China, is Tibet. And Tibet is well known for being civilized and occultic, esoteric. They make fantastic mandalas out of sand paint and then wipe them away. So it seems kind of like the hardest culture to really erase, and the one that gives so much hope, because sure, they can rape and murder and they can move in a bunch of Chinese to Tibet, but no matter how hard they try to conquer Tibet and to make Tibet China, China will never be Tibet. It can never be Tibet. Tibet is just too fantastical. It's too magical. It's too sophisticated. And I don't mean to take those words and say that they are exclusive to Tibet, as China has a fantastical, magical culture of its own. But it isn't. It is separate, and it is different. So there's also the connections between Tibet and Egypt, which are, you know, the Book of the Dead. It's not the only Book of the Dead. And the beliefs in chaos and order and Saturn and the moon, there's enough evidence to show a West Coast connection between the same Shintoism of Japan and the Book of the Dead of Tibet and the Book of the Dead of Egypt and the Book of the Dead and the Day of the Dead in Mexico. So the next thing we were talking about, the hidden Christians of Japan, where Japan had believed Jesus had actually been. Then there was a giant war, which ended up in the destruction of the Japanese Christians and the hiding of the Christians. But the old ways are remembered. Anyway, these are allegedly the real Chinese. But I have to ask, if a rape culture is the product of rape, is rape culture really your culture? So here's a non-Han Chinese origin story. There's another China, and it's worth knowing that China. So, in Xin's land, these are the Chinese conquering invaders. This is the Great Wall to keep out China. These are the Han that got into the wall. Officially, they're supposed to be Chinese, but I would say the Uyghurs are not just another ethnic group. They're supposedly Turkish looking, but this is because the last of them that are allowed to be considered their own people live in Turkey. Still, these people live in China to this day, and they are Chinese. And it makes you think about indigenous people and their cultures being taken from them, and their lands being taken from them, and their assimilation through rape. And the Chinification. This is the conscripted soldier, and this is the outcome. And it's repeated again throughout history. Here's an example of a Mongolian now dressed as a Soviet soldier right before the greatest tragedy of World War II, arguably, was the Lost Women of 1945, where so many women and children between the ages of 13 and 80 were raped. An entire race created And it's something that we're told we know happened, but somehow we're supposed to be justifying it because the Germans did bad things during the war too, or at least their husbands did. So, you know, the men were bad, so we should rape their women and their children. Although I'll ask you to find some evidence that's neither cartoon nor Hollywood, because I think a mob will probably have a hard time doing that. It's a lot easier to be vindictive than to think about the qualities of a situation. But I have to ask, was this really the right way to do it? Because if you're not being fair, you'll end up having to pay the bill later. So, these are the conscripted soldiers. Where were they from? Well, the Koreans are called the Han, and this makes a bit of sense because the Koreans are a people, a very great people, a very magical people, a very rich culture that worship the moon and the portal and have been divided, oppressed, yet have been always unified regardless of this effort that's been put upon them. And they worship the two pillars, they have the sun and the moon dynamics, and while they are proudly not Chinese, they maintain very many Chinese artifacts in their culture. So is it possible that these are Korean artifacts and they are not Chinese in origin? We consider many Japanese things to be Chinese in origin. Could it be that these Chinese things are Korean? Another movie to watch that's interesting, from Korea, 2009, Lost Memories, which is an alternative timeline that shows what would happen if the Japanese had never lost their control of Korea in World War II. And it's definitely an interesting story. But it could very well be that there's an effort just to confuse us about history, and that Marco Polo was right all along, and that, in fact, Chinese were not Chinese, but Persian before the Han, before the building of the wall in the Great War in the 1600s. So Marco Polo, who was from Cruzer, Croatia, which is a giant white stone castle island in the middle of the Balkans, was known for traveling to China. And he arrived back in Europe and was imprisoned right before the beginning of a great European war. And his stories were dictated in prison about his travels through the Tartary and into China, where he eventually met Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan is, until recently, not depicted as a Chinaman. He's never a Han. He's always a redhead. And in the old days, we used to think it was kind of strange that they would put John Wayne as Genghis Khan, but now I have to think it's just part of the tradition. And Marco Polo probably wasn't wrong about that. There's so many things that we're told Marco Polo was correct about, but we're supposed to believe these things that were incorrect were just such huge misconceptions that we would miss them. It seems unlikely. It's more likely that we're wrong about so many things in history because we saw the Netflix version. However, you know, it's possible that so many of these races have been changed in order to obscure the importance of them and to show that the Caucasian is some sort of a elite singular race, but I kind of think not. I think it makes more sense that there's just a grand economy that shares in the spoils with all of the nations. However, China from Persia, Persians from China, the Parthian era, the redhead Iranian Persian Chinese. There's a lot of evidence to show that. Before we get any deeper into history, I would like to address oppositional pathology and the esoteric sciences, because a lot of what we're talking about is what we see, and the thing about what we see often is how we see it defines what it is. And this a lot of the time comes around the esoteric concepts of archetypes and Carl Jung and Man and His Symbols, which was a book that Carl Jung wrote that basically describes the idea that without God to illuminate our symbols, man is in darkness. And with those symbols, we are able to reflect upon ourselves. It's actually the Sanskrit word guru means to come out of darkness into light. And generally, we have this concept of experts, and the word experts comes from experimenters who have navigated the path and have found their way out of the labyrinth, or at least have led us to the end results that they have found, which are the walls, the brick walls that they've not been able to escape. But if you look closer yourself and experiment, sometimes there are ways out of these walls, and these brick walls are actually just doors. And the keys to the buried treasure that are being guarded actually help us escape this system that we've been entrapped in for so long. It's because perspective and hubris is our perception, and it's a lens that we can share. And it usually starts like this. In the beginning, there's lots of bright, interesting energy, and we break it down. Patterns start to emerge. Often, and usually, we are taught which identities of patterns to notice from people that we trust. And when we start to see them open up, logos begin to form at what we call the delta point. And when the logos enter the psyche, then they became relationships in our youth. And we call this point the developmental psychology. Like, psychology is just the measurement of the symbols and the metrics in our minds and their use. In school, we're supposed to trust our leaders and our educators to teach us how to think and what behaviors are acceptable. And we're supposed to know that they're reliable sources. But if it turns out they're not, then we're supposed to rely on our own experiments in order that we don't become skewed and lose all credibility and faith in something greater than the heretics who've misrepresented and betrayed us and the subject itself that they have lied about. So we'll talk about chemistry later, but I want to introduce this quote from Yale chemist Professor Michael McBride. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, right? And again, experts are experimenters. So science is more than just existential allegory. It's experimentation, very, very much so. It's important that you be able to test something yourself. And at a point when people tell you that they are so well versed in experimentation that you don't need to, or that you can't experiment and try these experiments and become an expertise yourself, that might be, for lack of a better conspiracy, just because of conformational bias, is what I call it, because they want you to confirm and then conform both yourself and others to an agenda shifting pattern. And this is what scientists are taught to believe from a very early age is acceptable, because they know once they reach the point of no return that beyond the Socratic method of deductions that can be made through perceptions, and that there's only a range of consistent predictability. And beyond that range is the philosophy of empiricism and empirical observations, which is essentially a cult of perception. And while observances can be made, they can be augmented and are not trustworthy. So science falls into a philosophy of trust in illusions and a distrust in your own observations, which scientists have already been well informed that there are many ways to see things, and that right and wrong are merely points of view, and truth ranges between the pillars of falsity. So it's more important to see the bigger picture. And skeptics emerge and might say, in some predictable responses to scientists' predictable responses, I have seen, or I have read, or I have experimented, or at least my parents got me for Christmas that book on how things work. And the greatest threat to this conspiracy is someone getting their child a crystal radio kit and then putting it together and learning how things work, and then saying that they can see right through it, that they see a system, and in that system they find that there is a code, and it's been encoded. And this is actually where we get the word encoded, or coding, or coders, or programmers, because of tapestries, which were encoded with programs by code weavers. such as Penelope. So another way of looking at things is to say that these are some sort of intellectual fights that are happening for the sake of teaching us how we're supposed to view another perspective. And it's true that we can learn and wrestle with each other's perspectives, or you can be forced to see things a certain way. But if at some point someone tells you to see things that you have not been taught to see, or rather you've been taught not to see, it might seem less believable or hard to handle the truth beyond that range of acceptable belief and perception. This is where we get into this field of Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt is the German word which represents form or shape and perspective of that shape, because there are many ways to look at many shapes, and they're not all wrong. Some of them might not be better than others, but some might be better than others, depending on your values and your needs. So it is everyone's prerogative to try to see things their own way, at least just be able to see them differently and to find the way that is best to see them. And it's often we avoid that perception because we want to keep this rigid paradigm that is safe. But is it really? And where do we get it, right? It's usually something that starts the same way. We are to distrust ourselves. We are to believe we are worth less than ourselves. We are then to trust in these others who are, we believe, better than us and know more than us, because they've gone further in the labyrinth than we have, so we must trust them. So we make an arrangement and an agreement, and imprinting begins, and some sort of perception or perspective or philosophy is imprinted into you forever, and it's hard to remove, and it defines and shapes your pathology and your cognition forever. And it leads to what I call hypnotic reactionaries, where sort of like after MK Ultra, where Nazi scientists had pioneered mind control, and granted it was an end game of mind control, but what was it really? It was the study of oppositional defiance. It then led to the ability to control the minds through mass hypnosis, which open sesame in the young times of the 60s led to an entire society that believed that they had somehow created or discovered a truth that was their own. And Ginsburg had told them that the electric Kool-Aid acid test and their bus was just a CIA catch and tag and release program. While he wasn't believed, eventually the Freedom of Information Act did prove that that was the case. So there are many examples of important philosophers that wrestled with these subjects using their own senses. However, they did start with educations. Ram Dass, of course, very Ivy League. So it can be questioned, were these found or were they revealed? Also, I felt it important to mention the Grateful Dead. So many people seem to love the Grateful Dead, who used to be called the Warlocks, but they are part of the information campaign led by the American CIA in the 60s. So if you were to not follow your programming, if someone were to tell you that you had been part of MK Ultra or some related information, you were supposed to go insane, go rogue, and a self-destruct sequence would initiate. And there have been examples of agents going rogue and suiciding through bulletproof glass, which should be impossible, but shows what is possible with the mind. And there's a lot of hypnotic reactionaries to this day. You see them every day, everywhere you go, because of the media. And they respond on a level to vibrations and waves that are they precede the understanding of what it is they're upset about. They're simply upset at a level that is hormonal and perhaps radio But this kind of training creates an entire class of non-playing characters who believe that they are the most diverse. And perhaps this is a perfect word, diversity, because it is the duoverse, the two, unanimity minus one. And if you take any meta, the quickest way to divide it, or the easiest way, is into two. Before you divide it into any more, you would divide it into two. There's this concept of I and thou, which was part of Martin Buber's philosophy, of binary meta philosophy, of unanimity minus one. It is very diametric, very binary, very digital, very oppositional, and supportive at the same time. But it is not analog. It is not spectral. It is you ain't. So how many senses do you have? You might think 6 senses, right? Or 5 senses. But if you start to think about it, smelling and tasting and feeling, well, even eardrums and eye photonics are all sort of touch-based senses. And if you really think about that, you have one sense, that you're sort of this sea amoeba that is describing different ways of feeling. Remember that electrostatic means that you really can't touch anything, and you probably are making it all up. So you have no sense at all. But we may share one sense, and it's the concept of empathy. The sixth sense, awareness of how others feel, or how an understanding of how others and what others feel. And if you focus on that spiritual sense, you can discover and tune your other senses to better describe a more consistent, predictable reality. Last time we were talking about Marco Polo and his trip across Tartarian Europe, Asia, into the Chinese Empire of Persians, which was Indo-Aryan, and the indigenous Uyghur people whom had been displaced by the Han, whom come from the lands of Korea. And so let's get into what Marco Polo said about China. At the time, China was considered a Persian empire that was controlled by Genghis Khan. It was referred to as Katay or Kataya or Katayo. Xin is the name of the emperor, which we derived the name China. At the time, the empires that surrounded Persia were the Ukrainian Cossack Empire, the Poles, the Byzantine Empire, the Bulgarians. Below Persians, there were the Mesopotamians. But in the center is an empire that is essentially remembered only through being conquered by the name of Khazaria. And Khazaria was a noble class of grand viziers, often were involved in the trading and the intellect of the other cities, including, this is perhaps where Byzantine got its name. But the Battle of Kiev, which is detailed in the story of Taurus Bulba, is about the Cossacks, whom Taurus Bulba is the chief of, and the Polacks, whom the Poles at the time were in cooperation to defeat the Ottoman Turks. So they had a pejorative, it's believed, that the Cossacks were called Tartarians and then called Cossacks when they were no longer Tartarians, as long as they were working with the empire. They were considered the saviors of the city of Kiev, which is in the modern day Ukraine, which gets its name from Ukrainian, which means the skull. Now, according to legend, and in the movie, which is worth watching, I recommend, there's actually 2. There's the American version and the Russian version. The American is a very fantastical 60s version. I'm surprised it could have ever gotten made, considering the subject matter. And the Russian version is essentially the modern Braveheart of the 21st century Russia. So Taurus Bulba tells the tale of two brothers who are raised outside of the care of their father after he is betrayed by the Poles and their land is taken from them. So he vows that they will deceive the Poles by educating their sons in Polish schools. And eventually they will overthrow the Poles and they will return the cities to their own people, and the Cossacks will save again Kiev, this time from the Poles. And it's perhaps interesting that Kiev is so close to Khazaria and that this is the area where the Cossacks would have been invading from, according to this legend. Because the Cossacks, who are considered to be the pogroms of the Russians who destroyed and caused the great emigration into New York of the Jewish people of New York and of Canada, are also from the same place. And there's a correlation etymologically between Khazarian languages, and there is genetic evidence that the Khazarians are the modern Ashkenazi Jewish people. And in fact, it is difficult to find a Sephardic genome in the Ashkenazi. In other words, it is difficult to say that the Ashkenazi are from Palestine, but are definitively from modern-day Georgia, which is where Khazaria was. It's currently Georgia, near Russia. So the other interesting etymological link is the Finns. And the Finns have their flag, which is the Air Force flag, with the Shvazi on it, with a propeller, which it's very interesting that the propeller on wings is so Sumerian looking. And if you were to just put your thumb over the center of the symbol so that you can't see the objectionable content, it would seem very, very, very Mesopotamian. However, this symbol is, of course, older than the 20th century German revolutions and National Socialism, and so the flag is continually waved to this day. So, an interesting side note about the Khazarian correlation. Also, the Finnish people, their language is not Indo-Aryan. It is not connected to Sanskrit. It has 24 cases, which alludes to a derivative culture of many castes and high formality for interaction between aristocracy and merchant classes and different sorts of people and workers. So, but these symbols have existed for a long time, and we inherited these fallen stars. And the thing about these symbols is they're not meant to be understood often by the layman. And so they can go on for a long time and have new meaning that has been ascribed to them. An example is the post office symbol of the United States, which used to be, before it was an eagle, the symbol of Mercury riding upon the Earth disk of America and handing off a message. Another is the Jolly Roger skull. Skol comes from the Hebrew word for the skull that blossoms, skol, which means rose, as a skull blossoms from the womb. It is also called the Jolie Rouge, and it was a flag that was used not by, well, sometimes perhaps by pirates. Pirates didn't have their own flags. They would take other people's flags, right? But it would make sense for a pirate to take a banking flag like this because they would want to look like a banking ship. And since the Jolly Rouge was used pretty much by the Knights Templar and the banking ships to show that they were an armed ship, and we call it the Jolly Roger because of the French translation, the Jolie Rouge, which is because it was a red flag used by them. So let's start by looking at a story called How the Irish Saved Civilization, the untold story of Ireland's heroic role from the fall of the Rome to the rise of medieval Europe. And essentially, it explains that when the fall of the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, because of the Justinian plague, or whatever atrocities went down, because there has been a number of plagues and there are records of the 15th century and the 5th century plagues, which leads back to our calendar conversion that we'll talk about later. Also, the name Byzantine and Vizier and Byzantium are all correlated, which we'll get into later with the etymology of Tartarian words when we get into etymologies. So we're told that these rowboats, after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, brought all sorts of empire property to the west of Europe, where traders and merchants from specifically Ireland, the porters, were able to sell and trade this iconography, and the markets were filled with books from the Byzantine Empire and Rome, which were valued and were collected, and this led to the Renaissance and a rebirth of civilization because of astute learners who were surrounded in information. And this makes a certain amount of sense. We know that the keepers of information are educated, right? And they're better than other people, of course, because they learn things, and that's what it is that makes them so much better. Not. Anyway, so this is the crest of Carl Jung, and this is his family crest, which inspired him as a young boy to study symbols, because he wanted to know what the inherent value of these inherited symbols was that he had been given, and apparently had been correlated with a kingdom and with fantastical legacy of war. And there's a library and a castle, so you want to understand the background. But he ended up creating this, which was his own Carl Jung crest, and you'll see that it retracts the four-cornered flag into a three-layered flag, where there's a line of heaven in between the land, and the land is divided into the four corners and that which grows downwards and upwards, as above so below, which feeds off the sun and the earth, which is the perfect link of the torus. And above the head of the helmet is an angel holding grapes, which is then above lightning rods at the base of the name Carl Jung. So this gets into the idea of talismans and their magical power, and why people use medallions, and why they're so correlated, and why these symbols are the same so many places. For instance, the red shield of the Rothschilds, which you'll see it has the Tartarian, double-headed, Austro-Hungarian, Byzantine, Scottish Rite, double-headed eagle, or phoenix, holding in its hand the wand or scepter, and the ornament that represents this metaphysical realm, where you have a hollow sphere that is at a water level, and in the center is a magnetic cross. So further into the coat of arms of the Rothschilds, similarly, their more complex coat, which represents the five suns, has the four shields of the four corners of Europe, with a red shield in the center of it, representative of supposedly a very ancient shield in the center of the shield. However, what's strange about this shield is it's often represented as having horns, and then the centric disc shield looks very much like a money funnel to me. If you've ever seen a coin orbiter, you can put a coin in, and it comes out the center of a vortice. And if you know about fluid dynamics, what goes down also sends energy back up, out. So it's like a tornado. And so also, before we get deeper into why symbols are the way they are, let's look at the handheld arrows on both corners. So we have, it's a dragon and a phoenix, and then there's a griffin and a unicorn on either side. And the griffin and the unicorn, I would suppose, would be the most fantastical creatures representing Tartaria. And these hands are holding the arrows. And often we remember in the symbol of the empire that it was a bundle of arrows held together by themselves with string and making themselves into a tool. And it should probably cover woven braids, which are intricate, valuable tools that intertwine and interlock and save. And the Boy Scouts are not the only ones to use these. They're interestingly passed down by women very often. However, they're a legacy and a skill that are very useful, and to this day are often referred to as Turk-ish head knots, but I think we can say Tartarian head knots in 2019. So braiding a single rope, very important. Braiding is a very important skill. Here they're being held, and their weapons, they're pointed. They're very clearly for weapons, but they're pointed one down and one at the other, coming down. And the other one is not able to lift it up in time to defend itself. And there are 5 arrows in the hand, and this represents the capital as well as the nations and the kingdoms that are controlled. For instance, the dollar shows the American eagle holding 13 arrows. So shields have important meanings, crests have important meanings, and it goes back very far to the power of a witch named Medea. And Medea is also where we get the word media, medicine, Mediterranean, medallions. There are many more actually that you'll probably think of that I'm not mentioning right now. But Medea was a witch, and she was maybe more of a esoteric occult scientist. And this gets back into the idea of the Chinese, which symbol would they save, because they would make talismans by taking letters, removing the vowels, and turning the consonants into one symbol forward and backward. And you get a message that is hard to deconstruct, but you know what it means, and I call it encryption. It's sort of like a cryptology mixed into hieroglyphic symbols, because you don't necessarily have a full phoneme anymore, but there is representation of the consonants, which is sort of this inherent logic. If you think about the Kiki and Boba, sometimes straight lines and points like this arrow are thought of almost universally to represent Kiki when they're asked which one is Kiki and Boba, and curves are representative of Boba. So there is some sort of a logic to what sounds represent which symbols. In fact, that's why G and C come from right angles in Sumerian. And in Sumerian, of course, we'll get into later the phonemes of Tartaria, because the Sumerian alphabet's actually newer than Tartarian. And we have evidence of this. It's not, none of this is like without citation. There will be citation for all of these accusations and claims being made. However, in the meantime, let's look at the idea of the sigil and the crest and the talisman and why it was important to these people that were hiding these meanings from other people, because they did not want everyone to understand them. And so they would set them up in a way that kept them safe to be seen in public and misunderstood. And so it's a form of magic. And a lot of people understand magic. And not everybody likes what they see, although I like the POTUS in this picture, because he clearly knows what's going on and he's not too worried about it. But the people on either side of him are, because they can tell he's rocking boats. But there is power in symbolism that is not related necessarily to the observer. The audience might think that it's a mainstream Christian symbol, but the Vesca Pisces with the red cross coming out is Maitreya, or I'm sorry, for now I call him the Christ, but these represent an entirely older religion than what we've been told that they represent. The Vesca Pisces actually represents the 2 pillars coming together to create a portal. Between the 2 pillars are the sight of God. There is a stage that is set up for worship with an altar, and the top of the pillars are just below God or the architect. And so on the other side, you can see that there are on top of the pillars spheres that are representative of the earth and of the stars. But it's the interior and the exterior. One is supposed to be the north and the south, or as above and so below, or inside or outside of the perspective. And within the 2 pillars is one portal into truth, because on either side of the portal is not truth. However, that divide falsehoods from the realm of truth. Between them is a center stage that is lit by the architect, between the sun and the moon. Above the pillars are two spheres representative of the north and the south, or the interior and the exterior, the earth and the space, as inner space and outer space. However, above the pillars, they're able to see not only inside of the realm of the God stage, they're able to see above and out into the realm of falsehoods. It is only when they're able to see what each other are able to see that they're able to see the true light of the architect. And this is the portal, the one portal that is the truth, according to what is truth. Truth is what can be seen by two parties. And the symbol is very old. We see that it's been used for sports. This is an Italian company, Fila, and the Etruscan alphabet is mirror backwards. So we have Aleph is the name of the Hebrew symbol that represents the two pillars, and we'll have a series a bit more on Hebrew geometry, but it also represents the Byzantine bird because it's the two seers, the two whole seers, and we get the word Holy See from the Vatican's name, from being able to see, from being able to see outside the kingdom. So being able to see inside the grid is the aim of the architect and of a shared lens between the inner space and the outer space. And a view outside the pillars is a special, lucky thing for some, but it's also a curse for others if they want to know what they think of as an absolute truth that is true for both the inner and outer space realm. So the Holy See was responsible for taking a lot of this information. In fact, the Freemasons don't happen for hundreds of years until after the Catholic Church has banished the Jesuits, and the Jesuits have to start their own organization. So the Byzantine symbols became Catholic. And we know that the Catholic Church did not invent this symbolism, but for some reason we seem to attribute them to the Freemasons in the Enlightenment era. But we also know they studied Rosicrucian texts of Hermes, and that these are much older concepts. So it truly was a holy rowing empire that brought themselves to the information and then took the information elsewhere. They were conquest doers that took people, places, and things and shuffled them up. And you could not ever question this, or else you could end up in a lot of trouble. We landed on Plymouth Rock, and not that Plymouth Rock landed on us, as Malcolm X said. But who are we to argue with the finders of the New World and their manifest destiny? Because we would most likely be committed, or worse, considered witches, and that has a worse route to take. But in the 19th century, it wasn't just that they put you at the stake, they put people in lunatic asylums. And lunatic, of course, means a lunar addict, someone addicted to the moon. And we now know that the symbol for the sun and the moon next to the giant symbol are the sun and the moon. The giant symbol is Saturn. And so these were Saturn addicts that were told to never mention Tartaria again. If they ever did, refer to it, of course, as the old country, and that it was bad a lot of the time. Also, and the old country. Call it the old country. Everywhere was the old country. So, in that milieu of global conflict, doesn't matter where you're from, that you experienced, whether it be 260 days worth of asteroidal impacts and earthquakes and comets and devastations that lit up the sky and tore apart epic stone cities across the world, including Caracas and in Chile and in Colombia and in France and in Russia, where there were, by the way, earthquake in Spanish, called terremoto. Also, Krakatoa's Java events, and the annihilation of Moscow, where a stone city was burned to brimstone. And they'll tell you about the wood structures in Russia, and there were wood structures, but that's not a wood bridge. We're just part of some sort of Napoleonic invasion, and that Napoleon was just this super complex guy. And that war with Eurasia, we've always been at war with East Asia, or I mean, who amongst us can remember what it was like before and what the narration was before the 1790s and 1830s? Because it's all been erased. And this gets us into this concept of Paris syndrome, which I thought sounded crazy until I actually went to Paris. And it only works on certain kinds of people. Apparently, it's very common on Japanese and on students. And what happens is, when you've studied Paris and you actually know about Paris, Paris does not make any sense. It's not, the actual Paris is not like the studies of Paris. The place does not add up to interpretation. And of course, you're supposed to throw away your studies, right? And then believe what you see. I hope. Well, so Plymouth Rock landed on us, and it's a great story, really. The way it's told by people that are knowingly supposed to be liars. Anyway, that they escaped from the Dark Ages. And imagine for a second that you're in the Dark Ages. It's whether it's real or not. Just close your eyes. You're in the dark, and it's dirty, and there's no lights when you open them. Everything's covered in mud. There's no plumbing, and so you go and you find a book club. And the book clubs are cool. There are men's associations, fraternal lodges that are well lit at night. They're clean, and they have meetups. They have maker spaces. They have a fab lab, tech shops, lodges that are full of information from all over the world, and they're collecting more information all the time. And some of these guys are even making their own works about these works to explain the works that are too old to be understood. And from them are steam machines coming out and interesting contraptions. Brilliantly, they rediscovered the secrets of the pyramids. Except, where are all those new pyramids? Except for the Louvre and the glass hollow pyramids, and they're not the same thing. So, like, there was an era of Rosicrucianism in the 1650s that we're told happened, where the Cathars took this information that they had been saving from ancient Egypt and Sumeria and Hermes, and they learned so much about how it mattered that they forgot the dreams inside their own heads, and they started emulating and making statues and architecture to the gods, temples to the gods of other people, which Andrea Palladio, he either stole it and described it, and I think he's a great example of one of these lodge dissertationists, and it seems like pretty obvious that's the official story anyway. He isn't supposedly a creator of this architecture. He's simply a chronicler. The Andrea Palladio was a student of the works of Vitruvius, or Vitruvia, whom is also the origin of the Vitruvian Man, or Vitruvian Man, of Leonardo da Vinci, who was a proponent of his works as well. Now, as you've heard me say, Vitruvia, think of this piece of Trubian trivia, which there is a Spanish city called Trubia that is a Spanish Gothic city in the Spanish state of Astyria, or Bysteria. And it was a 19th century colonial industrial factory town known for their Trubia tanks, the homemade tanks, supposedly, of the Spanish Civil War. And these tanks were phenomenal pieces of machinery that led to, after the capture by nationalist troops, the creation of the Panzer tank, which was one of many weapons that came out of the Trubian factories. Trubia has the architecture, it has the technology, it's Vitruvia. So, Vice-Rubia, or the Western Byzantine Empire, the Western Roman Empire, Vice Tartaria. That gets us into the Spanish Habsburg Empire.
And España, I thought as a child meant the bread, right? Espan, but it doesn't. And there's some sort of Iberian etymology to refer to a stone or bronze and metalworking um, advanced civilization, which is an interesting. And I think we're gonna pick it up from here next time. Thanks a lot. So we'll be talking about empirical imperialism in the Tartary series. We're going to talk a bit about America and the name, and Giovanni Caboto, or John Cabot, or as he was known in Venice in his lifetime to his friends, Juan Ciabato. And Juan is, I guess, the John of Venice. And yes, this is his face. Um, Earlier, I posted the Ptah group. I've chosen the J letter of Cyrillic for Hotep, so it would be easier to find for Cyrillic alphabet seekers. But also, I found it interesting that his name was Juan, and Szechuan comes from this. So, also, this is Juan's house. You can see evidence of, an understory. And this is the other option for the name of America, Amerigo Vespucci or Vespucci, whom is also a Spaniard, Italian, a Castile. So then, last time we were talking about how after Krakatoa, an entire civilization was wiped out, hundreds of thousands of people dead, everything dead in sight, except not, because there was Roger Verbeek. Verbeek is a pretty, there's not a lot of information about him. He's born April 7th. He's from the Netherlands. He worked for the Dutch East India Trading Company in Indonesia. But he's the guy who somehow went on a rowboat to Krakatoa, only for a few minutes, of course. But he saw it, and then he left. And then there's, of course, the book by Alan Bailey about the Krakatoa Lighthouse, because, there was a lighthouse, and it's still there, the Fourth Estate Lighthouse, and someone supposedly survived in the lighthouse. There's a video, like a National Geographic, I think, made about Krakatoa, and it's essentially this concept that this man and this guy in his lighthouse survived underwater, and then they were immediately famous and made lots of money. But like more money than anybody ever. Lots of money, like crazy amounts of money. And yeah, this lighthouse, the Fourth Point Lighthouse, it was submerged underwater, and it's right, there under. This is just, it's insane. Because he was there for 30 days. Like, okay. But yeah, here's the lighthouse. A super cool lighthouse, don't get me wrong. So these are the traders of the Lost Archives, the Universal Trading Company, right? Universal Trading Company, the Dutch East Indies and West Indies Trading Company. The Occidental Universal, I don't know. Here's a recap of trivia I wanted to mention. Last time we talked about Andrea Palladio and whether or not he actually studied Vitruvius and the Vitruvian Man from Leonardo da Vinci, and we think about how that could be, like, Leonardo da Vinci talks a lot about, like, femininity and androgyny, and, well, maybe trivia, like, the electrical systems that Asteria had that ended up in the war that became Panzer tanks and were originally homemade tanks of the Civil War, and the electric systems that they had invented probably came from Tartaria. Well, let's get into steam power, because the electric steamers of the 19th century are fantastic, and they don't really require coal, they just require steam. And so I propose that they were electric. Now, there are lots of examples of steam-powered electric things. Nuclear generators are steam-powered, and nuclear itself is a steampunk technology. And they want you to convince you that it's dangerous, of course, like oil companies and whatever. Like, I mean, anybody. Like, it's really a safe, simple thing that you can produce a amount of heat that then produces pressure, and the water pressure then feeds off of this regulated cold water to hot water, then spins turbines which produce electricity and generate energy. So we have examples of this that are abound. Here's a Swiss electric steam train. Here's a General Electric steam train. God, that's a beautiful steam train. And here's, you know, an exploded boiler, and you start seeing like what happens when they don't know how to run an electric steam train. Like they start putting coal on it because it's intuitive that you can heat up steam and electricity to heat up water to make steam. It's a natural progression. Steam power and electric power. Here's the LMS Princess Royal Electric Steam Engine, but it's also just so beautiful, right? Like I believe LMS stands for like London Midland Scotland rail system. I think that's what it is. So this is a British rail. So all these trains were used to get gold and silver and salt from places. Here's the salt flats in Bolivia in Uni, where there's a graveyard of these steam-powered trains. And I've been there, and there's just miles of them, and you can climb all over them. No one's going to stop you. There's nothing else out there really besides harmonic frequency patterns of these hexagonal salt crystals that you can just for miles. But these trains, right? Like just look at these beautiful cast iron machines that are just abandoned here and compare them to the Tribune electric rail systems. So that gets us back into the west of the Red Roman Empire and the Spanish Castile Habsburg Empire, the Hispanic Germanics. And we talked about how Hispania does not mean the bread. It means something in Iberian to the effect of the metal civilization, which makes sense. And Habsburg family, the Bohemian family of Elizabeth Valois, you know, who was she was Parisian or French, and then her son was Bohemian. Well, France had very little power during this time because of, I mean, apparently they probably did. Let's think about Charlemagne slightly differently before he converted to the Roman Empire's Catholicism. I assume France was very powerful. However, it was maybe less global at this time. The Roman Empire also limited in a sense, but you can see where it was strengthened. But the black nobility of Eastern Europe, you know, is separate, and so you can see how the Spanish Habsburg Empire was just huge. Italy is split. North Italy is Germain. South Italy is Spanish Germain. So Germain Spain also is not one place. It's like the United States at best. It's more like Switzerland. You've got people that speak different languages everywhere, though. In the northwest, you've got Galatians. In the northeast, or the center, I guess you could say, you have the Basque state, which is in Spain and in France, and ought to be its own state, really. You know, it is essentially, and it should be. Then there's the Valencia, which, you know, just look how close it is to the Byzantine Empire. And there's just a lot of trade going on at this point with the Moors in the southeast, and there's a route called the Camino de Santiago. An important book to consider is A Song of Ronan, which really compares the Arabs and the Europeans on levels where the poor are with the poor on either side and the rich are with the rich on either side. The Templars and the Ottomans are the same. Here's the DNA of Germanic Italians, and notice the vibrancy of high concentration in the north. Also, the spot, you know, where something happened, and has the RZ36 phenotype is limited in the south, which is another interesting aspect. So it shows that there is a very specifically Germain Italy. And here is the South Germain city. You know, these are Italian Alpine cities. So Italy had at one point been actually where that red begins. And after World War II, when Germany was forced to return lands, everyone had to show the maps. Italy had made false maps that showed they were a much grander sized state than they had been. And even though the people up there still speak German, they're Italians now. So here's some Tartarian architecture. And here's the dominion of the Habsburg family, spread out across Transylvania. At a certain point, the United Empire is just so expansive that it covers um, all of Spain, but also all of northern Germanic regions such as the Netherlands. The Huguenots are included in this, and the Dutch, which leads to the 80-Year War and the Dutch East Indies Trading Company. And of course, Ferdinand and Isabella, this is an interesting, beautiful Ferdinand and Isabella from the Netherlands, or not Ferdinand and Isabella from Spain, or are they? I mean, supposedly they're not, but something interesting to look into slightly more. I mean, I'm not suggesting they are yet, but it is an interesting correlation, and that they were run out of town for their control of the Netherlands. Also, the Netherlands was considered the land over there that was run by itself, and it rather bothered the Spanish Empire. And here was Alexander, the Duke, and he ran the Netherlands. Also, notice that Ferdinand's drawn to be kind of a schmuck. I'm not sure a better word. He just doesn't look super assertive, and his wife ends up giving the kingdom keys to her handsome Croatian friend, Christopher Columbus. Also, here's the Habsburg crest, and I think we've gone over this. It's the dragon with the peacock figures, and from 1568 to 1648 in Holland was the war of the 80-Year War, which led to the secession of Holland from Spain, and also in this time was the looting of the churches of Lyon and a great period of iconoclasm. When the churches were looted, the symbols were taken down. This could be an interesting time to look for devastation of Tartaria because of the iconoclasm. I mean, we see the Bildenstorm of 16th century, the building storm, where people just went around tearing things apart and looting statues. And if you go to some of these churches that haven't been looted in certain places, you'll find horned statues of gods that are Athenian in Catholic churches still. So it's clear that these churches were not always well, I don't know if it's clear that they were not always religiously Christian, but it's interesting that they presuppose that they were built at a time when they did not understand the Bible, and therefore they had all sorts of symbols for non-biblical and perhaps pagan. Also, Spanish pillaging of gold and the stamping and minting of coinage led to the inflation of gold and its value being worth less than silver. People had enough gold, and they said, "All right, I got enough gold. Do you have any silver?" I mean, that literally went down at some point, which shows how much gold there was, and also how little gold there was before that. Also interesting is the father of Francois again. So here are some personal seals, and they eventually become representative of the kingdom's wealth itself. And notice the Arabic writing on the backside of the East India coinage, and the fractional rupee of copper coins. Eventually, paper money replaces these coinages, but not until the Dutch East India Company. And it's interesting that Marco Polo talks about paper money before this, but these written receipts really start again with corporatism. And we're supposed to believe that all of this information that the porters had grabbed from the Library of Alexandria, such as the Camera Obscura, and anything else from the Hellenistic wisdoms of engineers, such as the Hero steam engine, was just repurposed in Arabia, in like a fleet. We're going to start a series episode on the Latter-day Saints. I want to quickly read 1 Thessalonians 5:21 through 22. Test everything, hold fast to what is good, and abstain from every form of evil. There's better translations, but it's essentially like, test all things and hold fast to what is good, and abstain from everything that is bad, because this is the Kali Yuga and all. And with that, I say try a little bit of LDS and figure out what you feel about it, because it's pretty interesting religion. So with that, a little backstory on Joseph Smith. He was born in 1805. He was charismatic. He was an esotericist with the Jupiter talisman in his pocket when he died.
He was a dowser, like his father, who was a well witcher, which is what another word for dowsing is. And if you don't know much about dowsing, it's a way of finding wells by finding water underneath the earth. And it works. I mean, I have seen it work. My grandfather was a well dowser successfully, amongst other things, like working for, he was an engineer also. So perhaps you have to believe. Anyway, he was a good boy, this Joseph Smith, and he was trying to find out from God directly how to be the best and which way was the right way. And God said to start his own fellowship, so he did. Eventually, it led to a religion with a plural marriage system, which led to a lot of controversy about the church itself. I don't really see this as a big controversy. I'm surprised it is, considering, and essentially he had an alpha wife and he had a system. And after the Mormon Wars, there was a lot of widows. So, because there had been a genocide campaign, an extermination at least, of the Latter-day Saints from Missouri. And a brutal war that just killed so many people, women and children even. I've heard quotes that the boys and girls 5 to 10 years old begged not to be shot, and they were told that lice breeds rats, something to that effect. So Brigham Young, after Joseph Smith, led with the Missouri Wars behind him, and created with Joseph Smith, after the fall of Joseph Smith, this epic religion. And it makes a lot of sense. Also, progenitors would, like Charles Dawkins, who, a broken clock is right twice a day sometimes, unless it's spinning randomly, in which case it could be wrong all the time. The point is, Richard Dawkins, he did say that there is a selfish gene, and it's the idea that genes would like to exterminate all the other genes. And essentially, his religion talked about this prophet from this ancient culture that spanned the world, and the Mormons were trying to create this heaven where they were actually more than just on death to you part, you become your own existence. And it's a fascinating concept because it gets into this idea of Mormon transhumanism and becoming more than just a person, but becoming an entire type of civilization with beings underneath you. So Latter-day Futurism is an interesting subject, and there's actually a field of it if you're interested in Latter-day Saint transhumanism, Mormon transhumanism. Yeah, I'll skip that part. But really, it's about creating this heaven on earth, because you imagine that you've created a society where everything is perfect, and you try to convert them. You say, oh, well, when you die, you'll go to heaven and be with God. And they say, well, we already live forever, and we don't understand what's the difference between heaven and a place where we have no sickness or hunger and everything's happy all the time. And who is this God, and how is it more powerful and more knowledgeable and wise than we are? And this is this next level civilization religion that's slightly more interesting than the way it's been presented, and I think that deserves a little bit of credit. So also, he got what he wanted, and it turned into this crazy thing, and it wasn't so great to have 99 wives, because a lot of them turned out to be of other men, or the men were just in general angry and jealous for not having them themselves, so they martyred or murdered Joseph Smith in a fashion that made him more famous and made it impossible for him to do anything bad ever again. So it only allowed you a legacy of positivity for the most part, and then hearsay. So this is an interesting time to find out that Joseph Smith is not, they're telling you often he's a drunk, angry, fat, ugly man. So here's his death mask, right? And you get an idea that they didn't really lie about his pictures. He was, a rather handsome, man. Interesting also, right? So 15 years earlier, before he died, he had been reading out of a hat, and I think you've probably seen the South Park, but there's more to it than that. It's an interesting story about this Indo-Aryan American empire that was literate and had medals, and it's interesting that so much of it seems to have been disappeared, but we think it could be just stolen, like it belongs in a museum, Indiana Jones would say. But he also talked about different races in the Americas that had been genocided, raped into extinction, or, the Lamanites, the Jaredites, the Molochites, and the Nephites. it's a very interesting correlation with Alexandrian Coptic stories about Tartaria, and the mobile cities are mentioned in the Jaredites or the Molochites. They have the flags. This is from a Mormon book about the Jaredites too. It's like Genghis Khan's, hordes in Europe. Mormon scholars have gone deep into this. And we talked last time a bit about mega floods and wars and the idea of these storm wars that existed in the 19th century or before that are photographed and documented as floods and droughts and dust storms throughout the 19th century, including this picture of Sacramento that, as far as the eye can see, is both water and cities, which is an interesting aside, plus the electric systems. And you find that these megastorms were not freak events, but repeated about every 200 years. Although, coincidentally, I tend to think that those are the same events, and we'll get into more about why later. But the sedimentation that has resulted was documented, and geologists in California will tell you about the mega floods and the mud floods. So here's a picture of simultaneously the drought happening to the flood, and within the same year or two, you see a difference in the clearing out. And also, there was a Mormon island in the 1830s that's been buried under a lake in California because of a dam, and it was very, very vibrant. There was a bridge. It's been uncovered recently, more or less, and you can see the quality of the stonemasonry is almost Peruvian again, and Gothic, Visigothic, and alludes to this Tartarian concept. And here's another example of a submerged ghost city. Here's another example of a submerged ghost city, and you'll find these around South America, here in the world, but here's one in Venezuela, in Potosi, where they built a dam in order to essentially hide this church. They had electricity, of course. South America gets most of its electricity from the Paraguayan dam, but iconoclasm, communist era, right? So we've got the building kind of wiped out, and interestingly enough, it survived, and when it resurfaced, it was still the last thing that lasted, so they tried to blow it up. Seriously, they tried to blow it up with dynamite. This is what's left of it. That should provoke you as well. And there's lots of other churches that are, you can look up ghost water churches, underwater churches, submerged cathedrals, and you'll see that they're everywhere. Canada has full cities. This is like in Europe, I think this is in Venice, I forget. Near Venice is an island called Proviglia, and it was clearly a star fort, and it has arches and architecture, but it was used for the plague and to house and then an insane asylum. So I believe it was a biochemical warfare laboratory at some point, or perhaps it was a medical institution for studying, and things went out of control, but it became a very creepy place for the next few centuries. And again, look at the architecture, the arches, and the proportions of the ones above and below. So for the golden ratio. Another island that you should look for, because where in the world is Isla Bermea? It's supposed to be in the Gulf of Mexico. I've heard theories that people say it was made up as a tourist attraction, but I think that that's pretty absurd. It's more likely that the official story from British maps and from Humboldt sailors showed that it disappeared underwater. Either it sank or the water levels rose, and there's a lot of evidence for water levels and land levels rising. So here's a picture of these dust storms that I think we now know were bigger and longer, and not just, we're explained about this dust bowl that happened and people driving with these fancy vehicles that cost $500 across the country to just populate this new world. And you got to wonder about that. Like, the Ford vehicles were insanely cheap, and then they just poured out into the streets with them. So who amongst us can remember what really happened? It gets back to, we constantly are asking about how truth is lies, because everyone's lying to some extent. I mean, people will tell you they've seen this stuff, and who are you going to believe, because basically your options come down to tall tales, and that's about it. And tall tales are interesting in and of itself. If you start looking into the American tall tales, a lot of them come from the 18th, 19th century. You have stories like Pecos Bill, who sends his wife to the moon, and he rides a dust devil or a vortice, a vortex, a tornado through the plains. And David Crockett, who was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, predominantly of French Huguenot ancestry. And that gets into the Irish Porter connection because of the porters from Ireland who came bringing the French Huguenots after allied with the British in the war. But Davy Crockett, for all of his eccentric stories, was a real man. David Crockett was a senator. He was considered an amazing hero until he became renowned for his stories. And then he called him a drunk, and they said he was just making up all these fantastic stories and that there's no way these stories happened during the 19th century, such as there's one, he went to the North Pole because there was a mini ice age, and he restarted the Earth, which had slowed down its spinning from the inside. And he starts the Earth spinning again and heats up, and the Earth begins to rotate again. So you have tall tales, or then you have these sobered surveyors whom you have to trust slightly more, I suppose, than are drunkards. But who are these surveyors? They're the Latter-day Saints who don't drink, of course, and they're, very hard workers. And they were a godsend, let's say, during the Spanish-American War and in the Civil War. And the U.S. Mormon Battalion March is an infamous long route that was taken as the Mormons went across all of these regions that cover essentially what modern-day mud-flooded areas are, where you can see California's sand, long desert cover. Why would you walk through that desert? And up through the rings, into the lakes, into Mount Zion and around Utah, finding the center of America. And this is the Mormon Capital Battalion Monument in Salt Lake City. And you can see these Sumerian-like stoneworks in front of this Athenian neoclassical Palladio-inspired building that is of Tartarian ancestry. And here's a tunnel under the Mormon churches. There was a sort of golden dragon hidden in here. So there are tunnels underneath the Mormon temples that lead to places, of course. And also, the Mormon genealogy archives are built into tunnels into the sides of mountains. They're military-like fortifications, is the best way to put that. And the Mormon genealogy archives are very important because they baptize in the name of all those who have fallen without the opportunity of knowing the religion and baptizing themselves. So they keep very dense records, and in fact, run Ancestry.com. And this is where they keep their archives, in these military-like bunkers embedded into the sides of stone mountains. So it's sort of a fantastic story about this group of people that were supposedly the sobered witnesses and their belief in something that's so much of a tall tale. But is it really? Because there's plenty of evidence of the pale Native American tribes, and the idea is less and less disturbing of Indo-Aryan relations with Scythians in South America and North America. So is it possible that in 1823, when Joseph Smith discovered these golden plates, that they were real? And Joseph Smith preached to the Indians, and many Indians became Latter-day Saints as well, which was very interesting. And that gets into the Cherokee Confederate Alliance, because he shows the 5 civilized tribes in a sort of negative light at the end of the Book of Mormon. So the Confederate Alliance and the Cherokee, by the way, who's very fantastic and supposedly is written by a man named Sequoyah, though he even claimed to have gotten it from natives, were part of the principal 5 tribes, and not principled, by the way, but the leading 5 tribes. And they were the civilized. And civilized is an interesting term because these Indians were slave traders themselves and kept slaves. And it is notable that there are descendants of these slaves, not only of the Cherokee, who had thousands, also of the other civilized tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Seminoles, and the Creeks, all large slave trade economies, and were the principal slave traders with the which gets into what the Book of Mormon said about the final winners of the South American Wars. So Temescua started the Indigenous Confederacy, or at least created one, which these could have been Soviets that could reform at any time, like lodges. Temescua was known for his iconoclasm of Western symbolism. Temescua's confederacy was an attempt to escape the imperialism of the colonial empire of corporate British Dutch East India traders who had successfully subjugated, replicate their control over North America that they had. And, we're told that the Athenians were our original democratic link, but that's not actually where we get they were socialist pedophiles. That's not actually where we get democracy and self-determination, which is a more important thing than a dictatorship of the majority oppressing a minority. But we got the Confederacy, the American system of Confederacy came from, and the American system of federal tribalism came from the Confederacy of the Indians. The sacking of Tartary as the United Trade Company's colonial takeover of North America and of South America and of East Asia. So the causes of the War of 1812. Temescua's Confederacy was convinced by the British that it was a wise move to rebel against the United States. And immediately, Temescua and his brother intended to launch a triple threat with the three tribes against the British and the French. Temescua created a confederacy against all white settlers, and the British helped to attack these white settlers. So that's an interesting point. And we're told that it's because the British and the French and the Americans all hated each other, so they thought they could use the Indians as cannon fodder. Might be true. There's an example of this in another state, in Paraguay, which the Jesuits had built this fantastic republic, and there's a film called The Mission. It's worth seeing. They essentially took the same strategy as the French-American War and decimated the population from all angles, from Brazil, from Argentina, and Bolivia, and killed 90 to 99% of the population. Very few women and children survived. And it makes sense why they want to dismantle all of these monuments that are in the name of the fallen Confederates, because these are symbols of family and love and people holding each other together. They're not the symbols of hate that we are taught that they are, or we are reacting to, whereas we're reacting for. And I wondered when this started how this could go down, that Southern hospitality would become the next hate crime, because there was also a religion of peace now. There's no such thing as a civil war. I'm going to call it something else. The uncivil war of Federalist crimes against humanity. And it's normally called the War of Northern Aggression, but I don't think that's quite aggressive enough. So,
What we're going to do tonight is one called Let the Deceiver Be Deceived. And even though, for those of you that are here, I'm sorry that you had to wait and was inconsiderate, but I had to do something, and, you know, it's been a little confusing. And as you know how easily I get confused when we told you the shoe story. But let's try to take our time, because it's worth it, you know. Maybe keep you an extra 15 minutes or whatever, but it's worth it to see these things. I was talking this morning with people. I said how, you know, you can go into meditation and you can find this bridegroom and all of this New Age stuff and really get to the point of what the Bible's trying to say to you in your home. You don't have to come to church at all. It's not necessary. And then somebody said, hallelujah, or that's right, or something, because I guess I don't. But there's a very important point here. You know, you can do things and not know why you're doing them, then not benefit by it. So it's extremely important to understand, you know. See, that's basically the problem of the earth today, is that things happen, but people don't know why they happen. And then all the confusion and the superstitions start. This morning we were talking, Albert, I've given up, as far as I'm concerned, the Jesus prophecy of let the rocks fall and the churches collapse. I am convinced that that is the salvation of humanity, is the destruction of religion. And it would appear that they're self-destructing. I mean, they got to the point where now they walk in and shoot each other. I mean, you know, like what happened over there. And it's just an intolerable horror that fulfills itself out of all of the teachings of violence and fear and guilt and all of these things. So whatever happens. But when you talk about deception as we understand it, you look in the book of Genesis, okay? And there are two creations in Genesis. The one I want you to look at is on page 4 of these little Bibles. And it's kind of amazing. And it's a Genesis that you've never been taught. Even though you know, many of you have gone to church and were raised in a fundamental church or were taught in Bible study, this is a Genesis you were never taught. It's Genesis chapter 5, and it's verse 1. And at home, if you have a little Bible or whatever, you should really pick it up and take a look with us. And even if you could stop the tape and then go look it up, so you've got an advantage over the folks here, because I have to rattle on so fast. But look what it says in chapter 5 of Genesis. This is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created man. In the likeness of God made he him. Now watch this. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. What happened to Eve? Okay? And look what it says. In verse 3, Adam lived 130 years, begat a son in his own likeness called Seth. That was it. Then he lived to be 150, and that was the end of him. Now where did Eve go? What happened to the Garden of Eden? What about the forbidden fruit? What about the tree of knowledge? What about the commandment? What about the creation of woman? What about the talking serpent, the temptation, the curse? It doesn't exist. See, there are two Genesis. And this one here is dealing with a separate case altogether. You have that which is the physical Adam. You have that which is the spiritual Adam. You have this one here is referencing itself to the spiritual, mystical Adam, but just as same. All of the things that were in Genesis 2 and 3 about the Garden of Eden and the talking serpent and eating the fruit and all of that is symbolic mysticism. It's all allegorical. And here's the amazing part of it, Albert. This is so amazing. Nothing could be more a bizarre story than two nude people running around in a garden with a serpent chasing them, offering them an apple, and that's going to screw everything up. And this is our literal foundation of our religious life. Can you imagine? And then after the serpent, the snake gives them a talking snake comes along and gives them an apple. They eat it, and after that, they realize they don't have any clothes on, and they go get leaves. Fig leaves and all of this stuff. And this is our basic of our... and then you wonder why everything's screwed up. Nobody ever sought to explain what this meant. Nobody ever sought in any way, shape, or form to even suggest that it was a symbolic story. No, this is it. You believe everything. A serpent, a snake. Can you imagine being out in your backyard with no clothes on and a snake comes up and talks to you and tells you to have an apple? Well, you know, you would say, if you read that somewhere, you wouldn't believe it, but because somebody said it's in the Bible, then we automatically say, well, we've got to believe it. But let's take it literally. Let's take this literally. Here we have a situation where man ate an apple and caused a curse on everybody forever. Forever. Everybody who ever lives, including the animals and everybody else, are cursed. Even the ground is cursed because this guy ate an apple that his wife gave him. Yeah. The whole thing. Now, if that's true, then what you have to do is come up with something to save us from the great apple caper. What would it be? Well, how can we possibly be saved? Because here's the rules. It wasn't really an apple, but the fruit. The fruit was eaten. And having been eaten, everybody that comes after that who is born, because somebody ate the fruit, is lost. Screwed, as somebody said out in the audience. That's right. You're screwed. The whole thing is screwed up. Because of the fact that a snake gave a lady an apple, and she gave it to her husband, and now everybody is lost. Well, once the church got a hold of this story, what happens then is there is a need for what they call a redeemer. Okay? Somebody has to come along and save everybody from this garden affair. And then the religious had to interpret every Bible passage from that point up to the end as pointing to Jesus and his sacrifice. He would save you from the great apple caper. He would be the one that would redeem the world. And so then everything in the Bible from that point, as being taught by a Christian teacher, would have to point to Jesus. Every Christian Bible study, every student who studies in Christian schools is desperately trying to be saved in his sin instead of trying to be saved out of his sin. Because they say it's no use. I'm done. I'm dead. I am cursed. I am nothing but a stinking, rotten sinner because this broad ate an apple. She ate an apple. And her husband ate the apple. And everybody else is wiped out. And so we need a Savior. Not because you're bad, not because you do anything wrong, because this fool ate some fruit. That's the whole story. That's the whole story. And so then, once you have this, you have a bunch of, we'll call them over here religions. All different kind of religions spring up and devise a program as to how you can find this person who is going to save you from this garden party and make everything good. And so what you have then is the religious search or the Bible search turns out to be nothing more than people trying to find evidence to prove that their church doctrine is right. Oh, no, it can't happen this way. It has to happen this way. Oh, no, it happens this way. And you've got thousands of them, just like you have thousands of Bibles. Everybody knows you've got to have a Redeemer, but how? See, some people say, oh, well, if you do good works, so that's this church over here. But the others say, oh, no, you don't have to do good works. Jesus did it all. That's this church over here. No, you have to talk in tongues, and if you do that, you're going to be, no, you shouldn't do that. And all these people are devising methods, and they're all saying, look, and you know what the funny thing is? If you use this book, no matter what denomination, no matter what group you belong to, you can find whatever you need in here to prove that your position is right. Doesn't make any difference. It'll be there. And all the time that this doctrine became the gospel truth, there was something settling in Europe called the Dark Ages. The nightmare that destroyed in total the sacred mysteries in Alexandria, Egypt, all of this became the introduction of Christianity into Europe. On the scene came a religious direction that Christianity still reflects. And it really came from a violent despot leader called Constantine. Constantine, the warrior. And they've been fighting ever since. Constantine became the founder of the Holy Roman Empire. He was like, you know what he was? He was General Patton. Kill, conquer, murder, pillage, loot, whatever you have to do in the name of Jesus Christ. And Constantine founded what basically was the basis of the Christian religion at that time, was a doctrine of stupidity on the world, and plunged Europe into darkness. That's what it is. It's a doctrine of stupidity. And Europe was plunged into a terrible darkness. And you were encouraged, brother, and this is the way it was. You were encouraged to exercise your faith under the penalty of death. In other words, you had one choice. You either become born again or you die. They'll kill you. And this was what the faith really amounted to. The faith was this: you must literally accept the stories in the Bible as interpreted by the church. And that's true today. You join the Assemblies of God, they have it this way. You join the Methodists, they have it this way. You join the Catholics, they have it this way. And as long as you stay in that group, you want to be a member in good standing, you accept the literal interpretation as they give it. As they give it. Not the way you see it, not the way the Spirit talks to you about it. You've got to take it as they see it. Well, something happened in the middle of all of that stupidity and bizarre activation of this religious superstition. Came three people. You should know their names, because they started the first swing back at the religious demagoguery. Their names was Copernicus, Galileo, and Bruno. They were the three people. And they started shouting, and they said, the stars are suns, the earth is not the center of the universe. It moves and it floats through space. And they were talking sense. They were talking astronomical, scientific sense to these maniacs who were guiding our lives and our fortunes with this monstrosity called religion. Well, the church responded and lifted its hammer of love. Thank God Copernicus died at a very early age. He was a very young man when he died. And so he escaped the salvation of the church. But Galileo was imprisoned, and Bruno was burned at the stake. He was burned dead by the Christian church for proclaiming an astronomical and scientific fact. And the church could not live with astronomical scientific facts then, and they can't live with astronomical scientific facts now. It's not possible for them to do that, because astronomical scientific facts do not go hand in hand with the literal version of this book, nonetheless. But anyhow, they killed Bruno, they imprisoned Galileo, but thank God it was too late. The word had gone out. The dawn of awakening had come to Europe, and it was called a Renaissance. Renaissance. And this was a salvation from Christianity. Renaissance was a thumbing of the nose at the church and all of these horrendous teachings that it gave of superstitious rot that had people ground down into thinking man's origin was 6,000 years ago in his stupid garden, running around with no clothes on, eating apple pie or whatever they were doing. And this is where it came from. But the Renaissance came and it turned. And you know, it's an interesting thing. Renaissance is a French word. And you know what it means? Rebirth. Europe had to be born again to save it from Christianity. And that's exactly what it means. The world had to be born again to shake off the shackles of Christianity, and that's what happened. Thousands of people gave their lives in that struggle to give the truth to a world that had been deceived. And this is what it is. The world was deceived. There was never, ever a garden with two people running around talking to a snake. There was never a fish that swallowed a man. There was never anybody that opened a Red Sea. There was never a guy that got in an ark with every animal that ever lived. There was never a lady that cut some guy's hair and all of this kind of business. There was never a little kid that beat up the giant. These are all mythological allegories, and they were sold to you as facts. And nobody ever questioned it, because you weren't allowed to question it. You couldn't question it. You see what happened to these guys when they questioned it? What happened to a guy named Galileo that was a scientist? What happened to him? He went to jail. The other guy, they killed him. So how could you question it? You came and you sat in the church. And you said, hallelujah, hallelujah, brother. And you gave your money and you sat there and you became very religious because you weren't allowed to question. But thank God, the rebirth of a civilization in Europe really destroyed the superstitions of Christianity to a great extent, and science and intellectualism began to flourish again. Now, the statements of Jesus Christ himself speak to the serious error of literalizing Scripture, and we should really look at it. I'm saying Jesus Christ said that people who say they take the Bible literally were wrong. Look at page 812. And if you look at page 812, you look at the book of Mark, and there in the book of Mark, you'll come to chapter 4. All right? I mean, you know, you're adult people. You people watching this on television, you people sitting here are adult people, you know. Some of you are school teachers or whatever. You know better. But you never knew how. You know, there was a man came up to me last night, and God bless him, I think he was gay or whatever. He was a cute guy. He was 66 years old. And he came up and he said, "Oh, am I glad I found you before I died." He said, "I didn't know what the heck was going on." He said, I didn't know what to do. He said, "I never believed the Bible. But all of a sudden, I heard you, and there it is." He said, "I am so happy." So I give him a big hug. Because he was so real. He was so true. He was so legitimate. He said exactly what he felt. He said, finally, before he died, he would understand what the heck is going on. What's this all about? He said, "I don't know what the heck this is all about." Now we know. And that was very meaningful to me. Very meaningful because he was so excited to hear what life was about. He says, "I'm almost dead." He said, "and I never knew." And it's just the way he said it. Excuse the expression. He said, "What the hell is this all about? What am I doing here?" He said, "Now I know." And when I heard this, and I talked to him, we had a big, I said, "You know, it means so much to me that you spoke to me as you did." Because he really, his eyes were popping with excitement over the fact that, you know, he heard this. So anyhow. What does Jesus say? What does Jesus say about symbolism, about allegory, about the stories that you read in the Bible that you've always taken as being literal? Jesus says in Mark chapter 4, verse 11, "Unto you is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. But unto them that are without, all of these things are done in parables." He didn't say once in a while there's some symbolism, but the rest of it is historical. The words of Jesus says, to those that are without, all of these things are done in parables. Now there's an interesting thing that you should look at there. What does Jesus say? Unto you, when he's saying those of you who are within, unto you who are within is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. Write that down, I will. Kingdom of God. You are given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God when you go within. Now the point being, that's interesting. But go to page 853. You're on 812 now. Look at the book of Luke. Look at Luke chapter 17. And this is what's so fascinating about this and why this is so beneficial to you. You know, I'm not really interested in knowing about the kingdom of God. I don't know about you, but that sounds very religious to me. And I really, you know, have very little time for it, and I'm sure that you probably do too. But look what it says in Luke chapter 17, and look at verse 21. "Behold, the kingdom of God is within you." What did Jesus just say? Unto you is given to know the mystery of yourself, the mystery of your nature, the mystery of your mind, the mystery of who you are, the mystery of where you've been, the mystery of where you're going. Just like the man said last night, "I'm so excited, I finally have an idea what the heck is life all about. After all, I'm 66 years old," he said, "and I never knew what the heck was going on." He says, finally, he said, "I get an idea." So that's what Jesus said. The kingdom is within you, and the mystery is that you are given to know that mystery. You're given to unravel the mystery of yourself. That's interesting. You're given to understand the mystery of yourself. But unto those that are without, in other words, those that are, look, you got to understand the way this guy was talking. What is Jesus talking? If you pick up any book you want in any Dalton bookstore or wherever, and Swami Yamahama, Yoga, Gwanga Hondo, these long words, Find one that talks about Jesus. They know the record of Jesus as he spent 30 years of his life, 27 years of his life, whatever it was, in India. There's a record of him being in India, this strange guy. And that's where he learned it all. And that's why he could come back and he'd say the kingdom of God is within you. That's Buddhic, that's Hindu. That's what he was teaching. That's why they killed him. What do you think he got killed for? He was coming into the middle of a Judeo-burgeoning Christian ethic, and he got killed because he's teaching Buddhism and Hinduism. They'd do the same thing today if they could get away with it. That's why he was killed, no other reason. He brought a strange cultist religion from the East with him. And there's great records that circulate throughout India about this strange young man who came from Palestine and studied for years. Where did he go from the time he was 12 until the time he was 30? The Son of God, God's only begotten Son, the light of the world, the head of the Bible, and all you know about him is 3 years of his life. What happened to the other 27? Nobody knows. Where did he go? Nobody knows. The last thing you know, he was teaching in the synagogue when he was 12. He was a real Jew. He goes back at 30, he's a Buddhist. Where did he learn this stuff? They even asked him, that's what the Pharisees said to him, where the heck do you get the authority to say this stuff? He says, you know John the Baptist? He baptizes people. Yeah, we know, that's that nut out there. Well, you know, that's not done in the Old Testament. That's not a Jewish tradition. So he said, well, you learn where John the Baptist gets the authority to do what he does, and I'll tell you where I get the authority to do what I do. It comes from the same place. What's amazing, now this is the interesting part. Listen to what I just said. Try to concentrate on, because where are you going? I mean, for the sake of another 10 minutes or whatever, try to concentrate, keep your eyes open, and listen to what I just said. Jesus Christ has just said, unto you who enter into meditation is given to know the mystery of the kingdom, okay? But to them that are without, all of these things are done in parables. They're deliberately misled. Do you see what he said? The deceivers are deceived. The people who have been pulling the wool over your eyes have had the wool pulled over their eyes by God thousands of years ago, because all of his words are done in mystical language that is hidden. And they take it literally. Let the deceivers be deceived. It's amazing. They are deliberately deceived. What I'm saying to you is that people who do not meditate are deliberately misled. People who do not meditate are deliberately misled by the Bible, are deliberately misled by the Creator. There's a reason for that. Because the point is that you must first meditate to purge away the ego, the selfishness of the ego, the violent nature, so that when you do then discover the truth, you use it in a peaceful, loving, healing kind way. Not to make money, not to make something out of yourself, but to do for others and to do for nature and to do for ecology. That's why, first of all, a person must meditate. When you meditate, it's like flushing a jar. You drain away all the bad stuff. The water that comes within you is clean and pure and fresh. Your ego and your reason to compete and to fight and to be this and to be that and to do better and to do, all is gone away. So now you receive the truth, and the only purpose that you have for that truth is to give it out, to protect and to uplift and to bring the people of the world, the animals of the world, nature of the world into a feeling of nirvana in bliss and holiness and peace. That's why. That's why nobody, I don't care if it's the Pope, I don't care if it's Billy Graham or who it is, if they don't meditate and purge away the thoughts of the mind, they never know the secret of the kingdom which is within themselves. Now, when I'm saying what I just said to you is very interesting, because what I just said to you is not an accident. I just said to you they're deliberately deceived. I just said to you that Jesus Christ came and deliberately deceived people. He didn't want people who were not entering within themselves to know the secrets of the kingdom, because they misuse it. They use it for their own gain, and they use it for money, and they use it for all of the other things. And so he deliberately Look, go to page 812. Well, you're on page 812. You don't have to go anywhere. You wake up. You seem like you're just nodding off. Wake up. We're getting hot now. We're getting hot. I'm getting hot. I get aggravated because all I ever read about and see on television is religious people shooting guns at one another. And I don't think God has anything to do with it, and I don't think Jesus Christ has anything to do with it. I know I have nothing to do with it, and I know you have nothing to do with it. But watch what Jesus said. Mark chapter 4. Are you there? Okay. Why did he say, In verse 11, he says, unto them that are without, all of these things are done in parables. Okay? Watch what he says. This is why he speaks in strange mystical language. That seeing they may see and not perceive. That hearing they may hear and not understand. Lest any time they should be converted and their sins should be forgiven them. I don't want them to understand. I don't want them to be able to see what I'm saying. Because first, you have to do what? What did he say to do first? Seek first the kingdom. Look within yourself. Then all of these things shall come to you. The answer shall come. He deliberately deceived. And they took the deception and they taught his deception as the gospel. And they taught his deception as the gospel. And they give it as the truth. The deceivers have been deceived. And he did it himself. Do you see what he said? Look at it very carefully. I teach this way because they may see and not hear and not perceive, and hearing they may hear and not understand. I don't want you to understand if you're not going to enter in and purge away the carnal mind. I don't want you to see the truth of the kingdom if you're not going to enter in and purge away the carnal mind. Once you purge away the carnal mind, then I want you to see, then I want you to understand, because that which will go from you will not be used to lift you up, but to lift up the world. Lift up the poor. Lift up everyone who needs to be. Lift up the whole universe. Because I know it will be done freely. Freely. Sorry. That's a great, you ought to write that scripture. You ought to circle it down, stick it on the refrigerator. Jesus Christ deliberately deceived people who did not meditate. Because he knew they were not fit to know the truth, because they use it to do what they do. Can you imagine people in a religion, the foundation of your Christian religion, an inquisition where religious people would kick doors down and slice people's throats who didn't accept Jesus Christ as their Savior, that they would mount up armies called the Crusades and drive in and pillage and loot and do violence? Can you imagine Jesus Christ involved in that? No, you can't. Can you imagine today with Catholics and Protestants and Irish and Jews and Muslims shooting at each other and bombing children and blowing everybody to pieces, and they got the guts to come and say that this is of God? And you know it's not, because God has nothing to do with this kind of crap. And you know doggone well it's not. And that's why Jesus Christ says we got to keep the secret of the truth of the kingdom away from them, because they misuse it. They're not worthy to have it. And so I'll deceive them. I'll tell them this stuff, and they'll teach it literally, and they'll never know the secret. And they'll never, ever be able to come to that secret until they do what I say: practice the single eye, seek first the kingdom which is themselves, and purge away their rotten personalities of greed and hate. And that's what he said. And that's why he did it. So to be converted is to turn away from literal interpretation and see the symbolic nature and touch the truth. And that's to be converted. And so religion, when they teach literally, they deceive people. And of course, as we find out, they've also been deceived. All ancient religion, listen to me. And if I don't want you to listen to me and say, Bill said it, so that must be true. Baloney. Go to the library. Go to Dalton's bookstore. Go wherever you want to go and find out if this is true, the statement that I'm about to make. All ancient religions use false explanations to mislead the uninitiated and to draw them away from the truth. Everyone. Every religion did it. They wrote in a coded language, so those people who would not purge the mind would never understand what was being said. You want to read? They say, take it literally. The Apostle Paul knew. This guy they call the Apostle Paul, whatever his name was, Apollonius, his name wasn't Paul, obviously, whatever his name was, he knew. Do you know that he ran into a strange guy called Dionysius? And as soon as he met Dionysius was a mystic. And right after Paul met Dionysius, you know what he did? Shaved his head. That was a way to say, I have cut off everything that grows out of my mind. I've become a mystic. It's in the Bible. It's in the book of Acts. So, your religion that you were born in, your religion that you were raised in, your religion that your mother and your father made you go to church every week, and they said to you, this is it. If it's in the Word of God, I believe it just as it's written. Right? So nobody knows there's anybody even here. Say, there's one, right. Go to page 944 and see what the Apostle Paul says. Page 944. Okay? For the rest of you, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I'm sorry that I forget those of you who don't use those little Bibles. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Okay? And look at verse 6. The Apostle Paul says, who has made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. This is the same guy who in the book of Galatians said the Old Testament is an allegory. He's saying, don't take this literally. Don't take it literally. I'm going to, for 30 seconds, so tell you about some of the early church fathers who investigated this stuff. There was a guy whose name was Origen, O-R-I-G-E-N. 250 A.D. he lived. And he attempted to show the symbolic nature of Scripture. And this is what he said, quote Origen, what man is found such an idiot as to suppose that God planted trees in paradise in Eden like a common gardener? He called people who would take that story of Genesis literally an idiot. He was a church father of 250 A.D. Here's a guy whose name is a little bit difficult. He's a Greek, Aristobulus, declared that all the facts and details of the Hebrew Scriptures were so many allegories concealing profound meanings and misleading the uninitiated with the literal meaning. Here's an ancient quote that nobody knows who said it. So, let one of narrow mind withdraw with closed ears. We transmit the divine secrets of nature and the mysteries of life to those only who have received the sacred initiation. To those who practice true piety and who are not enslaved by the empty trapping of words or the preconceived opinions of the ignorant. Go to page 953. We're not going too much longer, we're almost done. Page 953, chapter 4 of the book of Galatians. The Apostle Paul is talking about the Old Testament. How many of you sitting here have ever heard the story of Sarah and Abraham when Sarah had the baby when she was 100 years old? Do you remember that story? Okay. And do you know, when I was taught that story as a kid, I was taught that God can do anything and we shouldn't question it. Can you imagine a woman 90 years old in labor? Can you imagine this?
Hey, what's going on here, Abe? Hey, what the hell is this all about? Hey, I think there's a baby coming out. God damn it. What is this all? Hang on there, Sarah. I'll go get the doctor. Hey, doctor, my wife's in labor. How old is she? 90.
Come on. I mean, come on. And the Apostle Paul, what does he say? He's talking about this story. Look at verse 22, chapter 4, verse 22. It is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondman, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondman was born after the flesh. He of the free woman was by the promise. Look at the next verse, verse 24. What does Paul say? Which things are an allegory. If you don't know what it means, find a teacher somewhere and let the teacher instruct you into what the word allegory means. It's symbolic story. You know no lady 90 years old had a baby. And here's the Apostle Paul telling, then how can somebody stand up and say, we believe it just as it's written? Here the man says, don't be a minister of the letter. Here the man said, that story's allegorical. And it's in the Bible. It's not good enough. As we wrap this up, I want to show you something in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that will wrap this up and spell it out, and then we're done, okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 3, page 944. And let's look at this one, and then we're out of here, as they say, okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 3, right? Okay. Let's go, and Paul talks about the Bible and so forth and so forth. Verse 14. But their minds were blinded, for until this day remains the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament. Do you know what a veil is? Something you put over your eyes. Their minds were blinded, And he says, until this very day, that same veil is untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament. The veil, my friends, is parable, allegory, proverbs, numerology, symbolism, the ancient mystery language. What does he just say? Their minds were blinded, and right up to this present day. And if Paul was alive here in 1994, his words would ring true. And to this present day, their eyes are still blinded. The veil is still untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. Look what it says in verse 15. But even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. They can't see it. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. There's the answer. There's the answer by this guy writing in the Bible saying these people are reading this literally. There's a veil in front of them. They don't know what the heck it means. And the only way that they're going to find out what it means is when they turn to the Spirit. That's what you do. When you turn into meditation, you turn to the Spirit that dwells within, and it takes the veil away, and that's why you understand things. That's why you understand things. That's why if you turn on a television and watch a preacher on television, you'll go out of your mind, because you'll want to jump up and tell him, you don't know what this means. And once you have that, once that veil is taken away, you'll never be able to think the way you used to think. You'll never be able to read these scriptures the way you used to be able to read them. Never. Because you'll understand totally. This is symbolic. There's a message here. Moses Maimonides, who was a Jewish theologian back from the 12th century, said, whenever you see something in the Bible or in the Torah that just goes against your common sense, stay there. God's trying to tell you something. And the more bizarre the letter, the deeper the truth. The more bizarre the letter, the deeper the truth. And there's no reason not to understand it. There's no reason for teachers to walk and to teach this stuff in such a way, because it says in Psalm 78:2, God speaks in parables. Mark 4:11, Jesus says, it's unto you given to know the secret of the kingdom. To them that are without, all these things are done in parables. Here's the Apostle Paul says, don't be a minister of the letter. Don't take this literally. Here's the Apostle Paul saying that these things are allegorical. And the greatest one is Proverbs 1:6. It says, wisdom is understanding the dark sayings. They're all the dark sayings you know. See if any of these stump you. I'll give you some dark sayings and see if you understand what they mean. Let's shoot the bull. He's 3 sheets to the wind. She spilled the beans. He's green with envy. It's right on the nose. I mean, not one of those things I said means what I said. Yet you know exactly what every one of those things is. How come? Because you know the dark sayings. You know the dark sayings of your contemporary language, but the people have not been taught the dark sayings of this language, this biblical language. So they took it literally. And so what happens? It says in the Bible, let's go shoot the bull. Some guy 2,000 years sits down 2,000 years later and said, they went, grabbed themselves guns, which fired big bullets, and they went out stalking a big black animal with horns. And then they fired. And the bull fell to the ground. Praise God. Selah, Selah. Hallelujah for God's holy word. Screwed it up completely. He interpreted it. Did you see what he just did? He wrote the Bible literally. And he broke down what shoot the bull means. Because you don't know. They got a gun. They went into the woods. They saw a big black animal with horns. And they fired and shot the bull. And he put it in the book. And the preacher says, thank you, God, for the holy word. We believe every word. He didn't understand that all it meant was, let's sit down and have a conversation. That's exactly how you become deceived when you take this book literally, and that's what Jesus Christ said, that seeing they may not understand, and hearing they may not understand, whatever it was. Isn't that interesting? That's neat, but that's the way it works. And you know. So you never want to, and you never will go back, because you can't, because your mind has been opened up, and God trusts you. If you've meditated, and you've sacrificed yourself, then your ego has been sacrificed. You will not misuse this for your own purpose. You'll use it for God's glory, you'll use it for the salvation of the world. Because as that sun reaches Pegasus, as that sun reaches the horse's neck, there will be people streaming out of churches. There will be people all over the place trying to find out what's going on. Why do I feel this way? And there'll be needs of people to sit and explain things to them. And that's what your purpose is. Until we lift off. Thank you very much. Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, all right? Let's take a look at it. And we're looking at the mystical application of the book of Revelation, and what you'll find as you go along with us on the nights that we cover Revelation here, the book of Revelation is a mystical description of the functionings of your body. It has nothing to do with Armageddon's outside. It has to do with the Armageddon in here, okay? Revelation chapter 4, verse 1. After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. A door being opened in heaven means that the opening of the higher realm of consciousness is now apparent to you through your meditation. Remember, heaven is God's kingdom. Luke 17:21, Jesus says, the kingdom is within you. Therefore, a door opening up in heaven is an aspect of consciousness opening up within you. And the first voice I heard was out of a trumpet. Now, the reason the trumpet is because the breath blows the trumpet, and the trumpet is representative of spirit that brings what? Music, harmony. See, the voice, that was the impulse that was bringing harmony to your life, which comes from the heavenly consciousness or the higher consciousness. As it were of a trumpet talking with me, it says, come up higher and come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter. See? So now here, John, or we actually, who were perishing in our lower minds, upon feeling the impulse of this spirit breath in the higher consciousness heaven, and starting to feel this movement of harmony, a harmonious spirit within us, are then asked to come up to the high place of the Holy Spirit. And come up hither means come up higher, and I'll show you things which must be, which means I'll show you what will happen to you. A lot of folks who interpret the book of Revelation make a serious mistake in that they think it's talking about nations fighting each other and things that are going to happen in the future. It all has to do with things that will happen to you if you'll comply with the instructions in the book of Revelation, and all of those instructions are mystical. So it says, come up higher. In Genesis 19:17, it says, escape to the mountain. All of these aspects are used to note that. In Exodus 3:12, it says, you shall serve God upon this mountain. It doesn't mean a mountain. A mountain has nothing to do with it. The mountain is used as a symbol because it is the high place, and the high place is simply the higher consciousness. That higher consciousness within you is heaven. The lower consciousness within you is hell. That's why hell's down below and heaven's up above. But most folks look at it, well, somewhere in the universe. No, somewhere inside of you. Isaiah 2:2, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains. So that means the higher consciousness. Carl Jung referred to it as the superconsciousness. There is a part of you that you know nothing about, which is the God part. It's the mountain part. And when you ascend in meditation up to the higher realms of consciousness, you're ascending up to the mountain. Psalm 61:2 says, lead me to that rock that is higher than I. Let's pause at that minute. Let's take a look at the word rock. Okay, when Jacob said, I have seen God face to face, he said, I will call the place Peniel. That's the pineal gland of the brain. When that is unregenerated, it is a sandy consistency. When it is regenerated through stimulation, it becomes as a stone or a rock. It's called the stone that the builders rejected. So lead me to that rock that is higher, and that is saying simply that when we stimulate that which is the pineal gland through meditation, it releases those hormones and releases those things which heal and open up the right hemisphere of the brain. Okay? And of course, when we talk about the mountain, we talk about the higher place, we talk about the higher elevations, we cannot forget Luke 22:12, where Jesus says, he shall show you a large upper room furnished. Who shall? The man with the pitcher of water, meaning Aquarius. Jesus was saying in Luke 22:10, when you see the man with the pitcher of water, enter into the house, go to the upper room. That was a prophecy of the Aquarian age which we are entering now. During the Aquarian age, at the time of the Aquarian age, Jesus is saying people will enter into themselves. and they will go to the higher consciousness, and then I will be there. That's where Christ consciousness is located. Okay? But of course, there's another statement. In Proverbs 24:7, it says, wisdom is too high for a fool. Wisdom is too high for a fool. And unfortunately, most of Christianity knows nothing of this. Actually, most of Christianity says when Jesus took the disciples to the upper room, that means the second floor in a house somewhere. That's the way they interpret it. It doesn't mean that. It means he takes those who discipline themselves, disciples, to meditate, as he said, practice the single eye. He takes them to an upper room, which is the higher consciousness, and there he meets with them, because it is in the higher consciousness where you touch God. When you raise yourself above the thoughts of the lower mind, you then enter symbolically into the upper room, into the higher realms of consciousness. So in Revelation 4:1, when it says, come up higher, I will show you things to come, that's for you now. If you'll ever have the courage to abandon all of this religious stuff, to turn your back on religion and turn yourself to Jesus Christ and obey him. I get a kick out of that. A few weeks ago, or days ago, somebody called on our answer machine and they were playing this song, Jesus, what a wonder you are. You know, I always get these anonymous things from born-again Christians. I don't know what Christians are afraid of. But anyhow, all of their stuff is always anonymous, you know. And somebody's playing this record over the answering machine, Jesus, what a wonder you are. And I thought to myself, Jesus, what a wonder you are. What's a wonder you don't obey him. Because all they do is play his songs and read about it, but they don't do what he said to do. That's what Jesus himself said. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I told you to do? And Jesus told you, practice the single eye. If your eye be single, your body will fill with light. That means if you meditate above the thoughts of the mind, you'll come up higher into the upper room of divine consciousness, and you'll be able to open to the right hemisphere of the brain and sit at the right hand of power. Now listen to this. When you respond to that call to come up higher, to rise in thoughtless meditation, then John shows you what happens. And that's what we do on Tuesday nights, thoughtless meditation. Revelation chapter 4, verse 2. John says, and immediately I was in the Spirit. Bang. You see that? Here we've gone through this first part of Revelation 4:1 saying, come up higher. I described to you about the mountains. I described to you the upper room. When you respond to that inner voice, what they call the trumpet, meaning that which is the breath or the spirit which brings harmony to your mind, when you respond to that and you come up higher, you raise yourself from your lower carnal mind above the thoughts of the mind up into the higher consciousness. Then Paul says, and immediately I was in the Spirit. The Spirit is only one place, and you call it the Holy Spirit. That means it is separated from the thoughts of your mind. Romans 8:7 says the carnal mind is the enemy of God. Jesus in Matthew 6:25 to 6:33 says, take no thought. He doesn't say don't worry. He says take no thought. Why? Because thoughts come out of your carnal mind. And all of Christianity teaches you should pray with your mind. And what is that? You're praying with God's enemy. And so you're asking for a lot of stuff. You're begging for a lot of stuff. You're telling God what to do when we have totally screwed up the world as it is. Instead of doing what Jesus says and going to the upper room, which is the higher consciousness, above the realm of human thought. Yes, it can be done. You can raise yourself above thought, and when there are no thoughts in you, then all that is left is God. And that's everything. Now, Revelation 4:2, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. Where is heaven? Jesus Christ said the kingdom of God is within you. Heaven is God's kingdom. So when he raises himself through this meditation up to the throne, he's raising himself to the higher consciousness. And now we're going to see mystical numerology. It says, behold, and one sat on the throne. One is God. 1 is the mystical number for God. 2 is you and God. 3 is new life, resurrection. 4 is your fourfold nature. 5 is your 5 senses and sacrifice. 6 is works and doctrines. 7 is the divine intervention of God. 8 is rupture. 9 is human consciousness. 10 is completion. And nobody ever said what 11 is. It's God and you, I guess, too. But 12 is perfection in Hebrew. 1 is God. So it says 1 sat on the throne. See? See, now you can see by the single eye. If your eye be single, your body will fill with light. If your eye be single, you perceive the oneness. Oneness with God. And that's why God's name is I Am, because when you meditate, You eliminate the thoughts of your mind. Now, you are no longer there because there are no thoughts there. Your body is there, sure, but not you, because that inner part, that you, that spirit you, that self you is shut down, and all there is nothingness. And where there is nothingness inside of you now, there is God, which is everything, because you've taken yourself out of the way. You've crucified the five senses, and what is left is God. So now you've come into that oneness where it is not that you're God, but God is you, because there are no human thoughts inside of your head. Now the only thing can be in there is God, universal, cosmic, celestial God. See? Revelation 4:3, and he that sat was to look upon like a jasper and sardine stone. Now we're going to enter into the ancient mysticism of color, of gems. Look what it says here. And there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald. So we're getting into color, we're getting into gems, we're getting into the rainbow. And if your eye be single, we can show you a lot of very interesting things. First of all, you should get yourself a crystal. You should start looking at the beautiful stones that are available, because the Bible talks about them. And go into these stone shops, these New Age rocks, and get them. They carry a tremendous and a beautiful energy, and they do have different powers. It's not supernatural powers, it's very natural. Like God, mold becomes penicillin. I mean, you know, if it says it in the Bible, don't be afraid of it. Christianity makes you afraid of nature. Forget it. Get one with nature by coming one with Christ and understanding these things. So as we prepare to look deeply into the significance of the rainbow, let's do that first. The rainbow in mysticism, in ancient religions, symbolizes a bridge, okay, between you and God. That's what a rainbow is. It symbolizes a bridge between the lower mind and the higher mind. That's the rainbow. And that's why people would always say there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, because gold is the color of God. You know, the streets of gold. And that's the significance. So when we look into this, it's quite important, because in addition to the rainbow, in Revelation 4:3, it says we have the gems of jasper, a sardine stone, and emerald. And what they represent, all stones in the Bible represent things. And that comes out of the most ancient places of the East. These stones represent the virtues of the higher consciousness of the mind and the emotions. Now, in the ancient words, karita, K-A-R-I-T-A, it says, in that city shining with the splendor of gems, darkness like poverty could find no place. So gems and precious stones each have an individual meaning in mysticism, and if you don't begin to understand them, there's no sense of looking at the book of Revelation. There's no sense really looking at the Bible. It says Revelation 4:3, he that sat was to look upon like a jasper or a sardine stone. See, this is celestial imagery. Okay, a lot of people say, well, you know, you shouldn't get into that imagery. You should, because that's what it says in the Bible. He that sat was to look upon like a jasper or a sardine stone. He looked like a jasper or a sardine stone. This is in a dream state or a trance state or in deep meditation. Okay. Now the sardine is a deep orange and red. The jasper is a blue-green kind of aqua. And so now we have a description of God consciousness. This is a description of the effects of the higher nature of your being. And let's take a look at it, if you would, with me, and you'll get a better idea of how to approach mysticism in the Bible in the book of Revelation. Okay, the color rose red, okay, rose red means love. And these go back from the most ancient of times. Fiery red is ambition or emotions. Ambition, emotion, okay? Now we have scarlet, which is energy, life. Is that coming out dark enough, Franklin? A little light, is it? Maybe maybe I'll try this one. Okay. Yellow, okay? That's kingship. Okay, so God's throne is gold. Green, astral, growth. That's growth of consciousness. So we'll put consciousness and growth. That's why they, you know, in the biblical stories, the sheep feed in the fields. Blue is intellect and peace, but it's intellect. What else we got? Purple is wisdom. Okay. White is purity and perfection. We'll call it perfection. That's why Jesus comes on a white horse. That means consciousness, which is beyond that of thought. And black is potential or ignorance, darkness, etc. Okay? So, now let's take a look at it before we go away, Franks. Yellow, it says here that he that sat upon was like in sight like unto an emerald. Okay? Now if we look, the emerald is a greenish color. Okay? And the sardine is a yellow red or an orange red. So here then, if it says, he that sat was like upon a jasper or sardine stone. That's what I'm looking about. Revelation 4:3. Jasper is green. And okay, and where we have green is the growth of divine consciousness in understanding and teaching, because it's a blue-green, it's an aqua. So there you have understanding, you have intellect and conscious growth. And then you have the sardine stone, which is yellow and red, or an orange and red, and that red gives you ambition or power over the lower things. And the yellow red, which is the rose red with the kingship of God, it's the love of God which gives you power over the emotions, and of course the divine wisdom which gives you conscious growth. So there you then see about the renewed mind and why it says he that sat was to look like a jasper and a sardine stone. And there both of them tell us that what it's simply saying in mysticism is that there is a control, okay, a godliness that brings love to give you control over the emotions, and a divine intellect that provides you with a growth of consciousness in understanding things and in understanding God. That's how they use stones, and that's why it's so important if you read the Bible. A lot of times you read in the Old Testament about the various stones and the gems that are in the breastplate of the high priest, and you just go on and read it. Well, you can't. You got to stop and find out what those stones mean to understand, because it's all written in symbols. It's all written in symbols. So then your meditation, now this is what's happening here. John's meditation brings him into this higher consciousness, which provides this, which is love, which is above the human plane, that gives power over the physical problems. That's what it tells us about the jasper and sardine stone. Now in Revelation 4:3, go back again, there was a rainbow round about the throne in sight like unto an emerald. Okay? Now this is a beautiful picture of color. It symbolizes to people who lift themselves into a higher realm of consciousness. This entire beautiful experience, according to John, is like emerald. Now come back here for a minute, Frank. Emerald is green. It's a very deep green. And green is for the growth of consciousness, the growth of understanding. So the Bible here confirms everything that we've said before. Heaven is a state of growth into the higher or astral consciousness. It's actually meeting Christ in the air, no doubt about it, in consciousness. But then again, there was a rainbow round about the throne in sight like unto an emerald. And they're telling you in mysticism in the book of Revelation, emerald, because emerald is a symbol of conscious growth. Okay? Now let's look again and take one last look at the mystical significance of the rainbow. And I think that's important to see, because it says again in Revelation 4:3, there was a rainbow round about the throne. A rainbow, as we said, is a bridge between the higher and the lower emotions. That's the carnal mind and the divine mind. It's the way for you to get from the lower to God. Okay, it's that which connects the earth with heaven, you with God. Now, let's come back for a minute. Let's think, what is a rainbow? So now, let's get some understanding here as to why the word rainbow is used in the Bible in the book of Revelation. Before we do that, we went a little bit far. I want to tell you, this is coming to you from the Christian Village Church in Forked River. We have, for those of you who cannot get down to the church, a TV network. Each month, we'll send you a VCR tape for your videotape recorder. And it has teachings on it live from the church. I mean, it's one thing doing this in a studio setting, but when we do it live from the church, it has a much more tremendous impact. If you'd like to get on our network, this is what you do. You write this telephone number down, 609-971-0537. And then, at the end of the program, we've got a reflection in there, Frank, but at the end of the program, call that number and say, leave your name, address, and telephone number. Say you want to be on the TV network. There is no charge for these videotapes each month. All we ask you to do is when you get one, after you're finished with it, send it on to the next person whose name we'll give you. All right? Let's real quickly then, because we're running out of time, take a look at a rainbow. What is a rainbow? And why is a rainbow used in a Bible as a symbolic reference? A rainbow is caused by a reflection of the sun. All right? Let's do that. The rainbow is caused by a reflection of the sun. That's Christ. We have to have the sun, S-O-N, S-U-N, Christ, okay? It's a reflection of the sun through drops of water. Water is truth. All right? So now we have truth being reflected through Christ consciousness, and it comes from a cloud, doesn't it? The water comes from the cloud. The cloud means the unseen spirit. So we have the water, which is truth, coming from a cloud, which is the unseen spirit, and then the reflection, being reflected through that truth, is the light of Christ. Okay? The unseen spirit in the higher consciousness, and when we finally allow that reflection of the sun or Christ through the truth of the inner logos, then we cross the bridge to the higher celestial heaven. That's why rainbow is used in the Bible symbolically. Once again, as you know, everything, as Paul said, that is unseen is made known by those things which are seen. So when we see a rainbow, well, we showed you the various colors, what the colors mean. And then in addition to that, when you see a rainbow, you understand that it's used symbolically in the Bible quite often because it represents the bridge from the lower consciousness to the higher consciousness, and it represents water, which is truth, coming from a cloud, which is the unseen spirit. That's why it says we shall rise and meet Jesus in the clouds. It doesn't mean real clouds outside. It means we rise to meet him in the unseen spirit within ourselves. So as this water or truth comes from the unseen spirit within us, it is then reflected by that which is the sun, the light, the Christ consciousness into our being, and there is the rainbow, and it produces the various colors of love and patience and all of these good things. Okay? That's how in the ancients, the rainbow is a sign of three principles. Principle one is red, which is God's love and power. Principle two is white and yellow, which is dominion over the lower elements. And principle three is the same as jasper. It's like aqua, blue, or green, the growth of divine understanding. So there is nothing in the Bible that you can see that has no meaning. I mean, if it's in the Bible, then you got to say, why is it there? What significance does it have? Why is it saying this in the Bible? Most people read, oh, there was a rainbow. How nice that is. No, it means something. Say, and the next time you read about a rainbow in the Bible, remember what it is telling you. It's telling you the truth coming from the unseen spirit, bringing through the reflection of the Christ, the sun, the light, and leading you from the lower consciousness up into the higher realms of consciousness. See? So though the cloud of your experience may be dark, your life may be dark, the things that have come against you may be dark, a rainbow suddenly appears amidst the darkness. Even though the lower may hide the rest of that ring, if you seek in obedience to Jesus Christ to find the God presence at the other end of the rainbow, you'll find it. You'll find it. And of course, there's also symbolically the bridge. The rainbow is symbolized by the neck. You'll see in the prodigal son and in Esau and Jacob, they would hug the neck because the neck is that bridge between the consciousness, the head, and that which is the flesh of the physical aspects of the body, the lower aspects. And that's Eastern mysticism. That's what the book of Revelation was written from. That's where your Bible was written from. And by westernizing it, we have screwed it up terribly. Let me make a strong suggestion to you. Stay away from those Bibles that make everything easy to understand, because they're taking the mystical language out and they're putting in what they think it should mean. That's like if somebody says to you, let's go shoot the bull. Well, you say, we'll not put in that. We'll put in, let's go get a gun and find a big black animal with horns, and then we'll kill the animal. So they describe what it means to shoot a bull, but they missed it because they didn't realize that to shoot the bull means have a conversation. That's what modern translations of the Bible do. They take mystical language, the dark sayings of the ancients, Proverbs 1:6, the parables of Christ, Mark 4:11, okay, the allegories of the Bible, Galatians 4:24. They take all of those things and they make them what they think is easy to understand, and what they do is they take away the mystical meaning. So I would suggest you stay with the King James Bible, because they just left the original language and they left it. They didn't mess with it. The rest of them have got you totally off and screwed up, and they don't mean anything of what they say. And there's not one bit of trust you can put in them, because they are not based on the ancient mystical teachings. Okay?